Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our final undergraduate architecture thesis honor award reviews. We're recording this, so I just want you to be aware of that. And we might ask everyone to turn off your video in case to make sure that the Wi-Fi works for our students. I wanted to just introduce myself. I'm Marcia Feuerstein, and I'm the coordinator of the fifth year thesis, along with Joseph Bedford and June Ma. And today we're going to be reviewing 6 undergraduate fifth year thesis projects that were selected from over 100 thesis students at Virginia Tech, undergraduate. These were identified by our students, by our faculty, and a group of outside reviewers. The 6 will present in alphabetical order, and the 6 are Ryan Burnett. His project is titled Architecture of Unforgetting. Charlie Culbertson, he had an untitled thesis. Yasmine Katkhuda on Domesticity and Post-Colonial Imaginaries. Carolyn Kerr, The Art of Memory. Graham Parks, Mindfulness Through Making, and Lucie Rigaldies, Traversing Wonderland. Each student will give a short 5 to 7 minute presentation, with the rest of the 30 minutes for each student going to be discussed by our visiting jurors. And we're really pleased to have a distinguished group of architects who will be reviewing these projects. In addition to our own Erin Betsky, we have Harriet Harris, who's an architect, a PhD, and the Dean at Pratt School of Architecture. Marion Weiss is also joining us. She's an architect of Weiss Manfredi, and she's the Graham Professor of Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. And we also have Heather Woofter, who's an architect with Axiom and a professor and director of the College of Architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design of Washington University. Once the projects are reviewed, our jurors will convene to decide on the honor awards, which will be announced at around 1 o'clock. We're trying to get it at 1 o'clock. And so that's really basically what's happening. The first person to present is Ryan Burnett, Architecture of Unforgetting. And Ryan, are you ready?
I think I am. Yeah.
Okay, good.
If we're ready to get started, I can go right ahead.
Great. So you should be able to share your screen.
Looks good.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll get started. So my thesis aims to explore the role of architecture regarding the act of remembering, and looking at questions of how, why, and what we remember. And now memory has 2 constituent elements, history and interpretation. And in this thesis, history is defined as facts in any form. These are physical or narrative artifacts that must be uncovered to tell a complete story. Whereas interpretation is the process of giving a voice to these physical artifacts and starting new conversations about narratives that acknowledge all elements of the past and outline our aspirations for the future. And the place where I'm bringing these concepts together is Rocky Springs, Mississippi, a trading post town on the Natchez Trace that began to disappear after the US Civil War. And today, the site is a recognized ghost town with an official population of 0. And while the site does contain some historical information from the National Park Service, it struggles to tell the full story about this place and does little to document things such as Rocky Springs' extensive reliance on slave labor. And so to account for this lack of information, my project aims to create a process through which history can be found and interpreted on the site. And this starts by overlaying the site with a multi-scaled grid to guide archaeological efforts and to act as the one known constant here. And for the sake of the project, the locations of physical artifacts on the site have been estimated. But again, the goal here is not to produce a definitive product. It's about creating the process for what to do when these things are inevitably encountered. So in the event that something is found, such as the foundation of a structure, the process starts by using the grid as a tool to outline search areas and to inform locations for the digging of archaeological test pits, so that elements can be studied and analyzed. After this, the process moves on to present and to preserve these elements, as well as this newfound knowledge in situ, to establish a baseline that puts all the facts on the table and keeps them as a foundation for the rest of the project. Next, a core 10 lattice is constructed that juxtaposes the previous boundaries of this place with a structural system that's based on the survey grid. And this acknowledges and incorporates the space that once existed into the rest of the site story and marks it as a known element. And the manifestation of the grid here, in this moment where it's utilized, references the fact that there's still more to be discovered beyond the boundaries of this artifact, where the grid is still invisible. And lastly, the intervention and the story are further expanded through the addition of our own artifacts. And in this way, these pavilions are also meant to act as collaborative platforms for other voices to take part in questions and conversations about what's been found. And the pavilions aid these conversations through moments of semi-ephemerality, wherein the structures fluctuate between states of visibility and invisibility to briefly frame these new works before vanishing so that the work can speak directly to the landscape. And this pavilion that I've described is not an isolated condition. It's part of the process that's continued across the entire site, wherever artifacts are encountered, so they can be analyzed and connected as elements of one site story. And these pavilions also aren't the only explorations being done here. The story of this site goes back much further than just the founding of Rocky Springs. And the process addresses this by calling for soil samples to be taken in several locations to encounter and analyze deeper layers of earth and history that existed here before 19th century US colonial influence. And as with the rest of the processes that take place, these excavations are informed by the grid and marked with a small construction that serves as a remnant of this process. And chance encounters with these remnants will provide visitors with necessary narratives and help further tie this landscape together as one. To document some of this work, witness posts are being constructed using a Gabian system at major intersections of the macro grid on the site. And the static regularity of these elements aids the survey process by measuring and providing physical references on the site. But they also feature a more fluid form of measurement through their infill. These originally empty frames will be filled over time with leftover material from nearby archaeological digs. And the ritualistic process of filling these up allows the structures to measure an additional dimension by keeping track of the work that's already been done here and what's already been encountered. In addition to these analytical and remnant elements, the process calls for the construction of an orientational nexus to be situated at each of the two trailheads on the site. And while these nexuses are entirely new constructions, they're still secondary to the archaeological process, and their relationship to the grid reflects this. They're placed orthogonally within fields of columns that make the grid evident, and their dimensions and proportions directly correspond to those of the survey grid to reinforce the fact that these structures are still a product of this process. And the purpose of these structures is to give additional necessary context to those who visit the site. They act as libraries that consolidate and archive all of the information that's been gathered to date, and then they present it in a cohesive manner within an architectural framework that orients visitors to the very processes of exploration utilized here. And these structures are also designed to acknowledge that the process of unforgetting is far from complete. As such, they begin to disappear and disassemble as one progresses through them. And as information becomes scarcer, the narrative panels also disappear and are replaced by panels that map out areas of current exploration to say, we don't have this information yet, but this is where we're looking for it. As time goes on, these structures are expanded. First, through the creation of additional narrative plates, and then, when necessary, through the extensions of the structures themselves. And this expansion is continued in the details as well. So the roof shading system here is comprised of small modular panels which work together to depict a scaled version of known elements on the site. So that as we discover more, this site plan will gradually be filled in, and the structure can continue to grow proportionally with our accumulated knowledge of this place. And the final element that I'm proposing for the site is a moment where the visitor and the process itself are stopped to acknowledge the 2,000 or more slaves of Rocky Springs. This town was a direct product of their suffering. And while the entire discovery process here is meant to recontextualize the landscape with these facts, the project needs to take a moment to acknowledge that these people are well and truly lost to time. And so 14 blank marble slabs are drawn up from the ground to provide spaces for over 2,100 names. And in this project that's based on the physical manifestations of a process of searching, this is the one unknown element that's represented from the start, because this context and all the questions and conversations associated with it is absolutely necessary, even as an unknown. And my hope is that their names will be found, but even so, the process will go on and people will visit the site like they always have. Only now they'll visit it equipped with the means to truly understand this place. And as they continue to return, the beauty and nuance of the forest will remain the same, yet the site will continue to change and develop with each visit as more of what's been lost, intentionally or otherwise, is brought to the surface and unforgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let the jurors speak now. Marion, Aaron, Harriet, Heather?
If you want, I'm happy to go back to any other slides. I also have a little board here that has.
Just a technical question. You're leaving all these elements exposed to, all these pieces exposed to the elements.
Yes.
Is there an idea that they will weather and perhaps even fade away over time, or are they all treated in some miraculous way so that the rather invasive climate of this area will not deteriorate them?
That part of the my intention is that with part of the initial process of taking these elements, some of them will have to be taken away to labs to be analyzed, and because what usually happens is elements are taken to be studied in a lab and they kind of recreate the site that they were found in, and my intention was that then after that process, elements that were taken away will be brought back and elements that were left in the site will be treated in a way that tries to preserve them and maintains them in a way that they're presented almost as exhibits in addition to just being physical artifacts of this place.
I'm talking about the the structural elements that you're building with. I mean, some of them are metal and will rust. Some of them are wood that will age.
They're all the pavilions, the memory pavilions. So I'll go back to these are core 10. So these are steel and they are intended to be rusted to kind of reinforce
all
the fact
of them are core 10?
All of these memory pavilions, yes, these are core 10. Whereas the Nexus structures, these structures that house the narrative panels are painted metal. And the idea behind that is so that I don't want these necessarily to deteriorate and weather away. But like I said, with the memory pavilion in that state of semi-ephemerality, I want them not necessarily to weather away, but to be able to be either assembled or taken apart as needed.
Well, yeah, it's a little bizarre because you're using the language of wood timber construction that then turns out to be metal. I never would have gotten it from these very evocative drawings. It could have used another type of drawing to convey that. The beauty and consistency of a drawing, and you're a wizard at this kind of work, is also its limitation. It could have used the intersection of some other modes of representation or analysis. But I also wonder about the kind of logic behind that. Your very first image is an image that evokes a almost romantic notion of a rural South and habitation and perhaps even slave quarters. And that image then disappears in the rest of the project in favor of this very abstract geometric play. And I use the word play on purpose. And I'm just wondering if you ever thought about finding a way to make the work more figural, more evocative, more related to historical conditions, more responsive to the climate, any of those kind of issues that might lead to a less abstract and gridded development?
That is something that I considered, but I wanted to put forth the idea with this thesis of the architecture simply acting as a literal and figurative framework, whereas the architecture isn't seeking to represent something, but it's just seeking to aid in the process of encountering these things and then presenting the necessary narratives associated with them, as opposed to creating some imagery that you encounter. I wanted to go for to pursue a state of kind of ambiguity in favor of creating, leading to additional conversations about this place, as opposed to making more kind of definitive assumptions or things about how this place might have looked. It's more about encountering the actual facts and seeing them under the ground and then learning about those.
So, Ryan, I have a couple of projects that might be interesting references to you for you, and I think they relate somewhat to Aaron's question about the abstraction versus the figural.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those is a project that's occurring right now in St. Louis. The artist's name is Damon Davis, and he's working on a project in Mill Creek Valley. And very similar to yours, Mill Creek Valley is this area of St. Louis that was completely razed for highway infrastructure, but it was the home of a really thriving, Black community in the center of the city. And they were forcibly moved from their place of residence, and the site was completely razed. So it is a story about forgotten people, in some ways similar to yours. And the artist is actually making kind of columns that are then, he has like a glass floor, and he's extracting earth and bringing that earth, up. So there's many sort of parallels to what you're talking about and some of the things that he's trying to do. And that balance also of the abstract and the figural, because he's also trying to tell this narrative of this thriving community of people. And so you might want to reference that project because he has this gridded sort of space that reflects the kind of spacing of the homes and sort of the kind of density that existed there once on the site that is no longer there. But then as he stretches beyond the project, he has some figural representations, but those figural representations are kind of a balance between the narrative story that he's trying to tell and relating back to this gridded kind of abstract set of pillars that has a certain weight and heaviness to them because of the nature of the story. The other project that I'm thinking about is Burry's project in Gibellina, Sicily. It's a town that was completely destroyed by an earthquake, so it has a totally different context. But the artist filled up the blocks of the town with concrete, and then you kind of move through that. It's actually on a Virginia Tech visit that I first discovered this project, and then I went back years later. But there were these remnants, artifacts, things that were discovered. And then he made these styrofoam figures and playful interventions, which was really interesting, right? But then when I came back 10 years later to the site, those were gone. And what was left was this grid. And I think that sense of memory and loss and how your materials deteriorate is really important, because this thing has, a 5-year lifespan, 10-year, 20-year, 100-year, hopefully, our memories are extending significantly, and it's affected completely by the environment and our social histories. So bringing together ecology or thinking about the changes in our environment, as well as the changes of social issues that have formed and shaped these narratives and spaces. I think the two of those narratives they're intertwined in some ways, or can be. And the last project that I just wanted to reference for you is Cahokia Mounds, which is also near St. Louis. but it's, you know, an ancient people, but you see these mounds in the landscape that, that don't have kind of structures built on them that are replicas of a bygone period. But this idea of drilling into the ground, so there's a series of cores that have been taken. And I think that's also a really fascinating question about these ground cores and what kind of narrative they tell us in terms of the artifacts that are found within them. And instead of having, like, what did you call them? You called them these sort of gridded columns. You had a name for it. I'm looking in my notes.
Witness
I might have
posts,
referred to them
right?
as-
Witness
there are
posts.
witness posts
Witness
and then there are
posts.
the remnants columns. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious about just adding dirt to them, you know, like as opposed to when you see the, like a core that's actually taken out of a ground when you're constructing a building, or even if you're doing this for scientific research, they're fascinating and they're somewhat structural. I'm kind of curious about the core itself, and if the core itself couldn't populate your site, as opposed to saying, okay, every so many years we're going to add dirt to this column, which is maybe you can talk about the differences in excavating the ground versus an active, and maybe that's what you're trying to do, like an active creation of a core, so to speak, kind of done by people. So I want to learn a little bit more about that, because I think, again, it goes to ecology and social issues and their relationship to one another, which I think has a lot of potential in your project. So thank you. There's some beautiful parts. I didn't talk about that, but the idea of collage and montage in your project, I think, is really fitting.
Thank you.
Ryan, I just want to pick up on Heather's last comments, which are, I think, very interesting, because in many ways, yes, this is a beautifully presented project and it's a beautifully reflected upon topic that you're trying to give measure to. And I think that some of the things I've really appreciated is this recognition that there's a tactile legacy that is giving us insight about a site that has now got an absence at first reading. And what you're trying to say is that this is a moment where the first reading that somebody might have is going to be renewed by that which you are bringing to the site that was never there. So you are bringing into focus that which is unseen. And so it was interesting, as Heather was talking about some references, I was having my own version of references, of which the most vivid one is Walter de Maria's Lightning Field, where there is a grid, which in many ways is just brought into focus by the act of lightning, and yet is barely visible otherwise. And the other one that I was thinking about was Robert Irwin's Traveling Fence through the eucalyptus grove at UC San Diego, where the topography of the site is very, very vivid, but the datum of that traveling fence is dead on horizontal. So it begins 2 inches above the ground at one end and almost 30 feet in the air as it travels across the site. And because of that, we appreciate the unseen topography, which is so long that we would never notice it without that measure. And so I think what I'm wondering about as I look at your project is, I tend to agree with the kind of provocation that Aaron had brought to your notice, which is, while you have created a comprehensive form of representation here to tell a narrative that we are, in a sense, seduced and in a trance as we listen to and see the drawings, what we don't see perhaps is the real tactile artifact, in particular, as you talked about those cores and what those cores reveal. And I think it would be interesting to look at building upon your intrinsic predisposition to this form of representation, what else you could bring to intensify your insights and our understanding of those artifacts as they have greater value, of which I would argue that the cores themselves and those core samples might be the artifact that you, in fact, really interrogate and delay the addition of, in this case, with your witness posts, the gabions and the posts, but maybe figure out, could we in fact see those revealed at those core locations and elevated within that narrative grid that is now a physically distributed one? Secondly, I wonder when we go, if we can go to your installation with all the, in a sense, posts and sort of the posting of the stories and narratives. as we look at that, you were saying that that might be an indefinitely large grove over time, which might tell more and more stories. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, as information is found, yeah, the structure is supposed to adapt so that, yeah, the stories can be filled in.
Right. And what I find intriguing, though, is that you've taken the convention of the text elevated as a kind of a wall, and it is somewhere between being an enclosure and being, in a sense, a piece of text. And that's where I would imagine that it might be interesting to kind of reconceive not something that is really very much like those witness posts, but not, because it's a structure and we've got the trellised light coming through the metal. I think that's where I find that the kind of predisposition to the conventional joist hanger that you have there with, in other words, the kind of true representation of how this might be built, as you could imagine as installation. I would say that's the very moment when I look at this drawing that I find you're leaning towards a convention, strays from the poetry of what you're trying to reveal. And in this case, I would imagine that there could be an opportunity, for instance, to carve into the earth, to maybe line that cut in the earth with these stories and narratives. I don't want to get too mile in on you, but I'm just saying that that this could be an opportunity to have a counterpoint to the very field or the datum by which you've given us an obligation to know that that site's being measured in ways that we can't understand until we reveal that story. But maybe that story is not, in a sense, cast in such a conventional installation as we see here, but maybe becomes more unconventional, as your very provocative entry words, I think, led us to believe.
I will, on that, on the notion of digging under the ground, I will say that I adopted this kind of light framework above the ground as a way I wanted this to sit on top of the site and to change the site or change your perception of the site without changing the site itself, so that we don't have to kind of dig down and destroy or encounter potential artifacts to reveal this kind of narrative, but so that the narrative can sit on top and grow and either potentially disappear in the future if it's not needed, kind of without a trace. So that that was important to me.
Yeah, but it's a little bit, there's a lot of contradictions here, because then you build it out of Corten steel. And you know what's ironic to me, the more I look at this project, the more architecture I see and the less memory and place I see. And I'm a little concerned that you're so deft at making evocative forms and at playing out geometries that it might be in danger of getting the best of you if it's not already gotten the best of you. And what I miss in the presentation is an analysis of the actual site, of its contours, of its biotope, of what fragments there actually are. I miss a photograph of a representative fragment. And the result is that you get something in which the architecture, which is completely divorced from any kind of local context, that's made out of materials that are mined somewhere in Borneo, is trucked onto the site, imposed on it with an abstract idea. And for all of your intentions of evoking the place just fades away. And that even shows up on the boards, where the boards are, again, completely separate from the architecture. They're kind of slapped onto it. And then they are filled with endless amounts of text from what little you've shown of us. And by the way, the standard rule is no more than 3 to 350 words on any panel of text, which looks like you're exceeding, rather than having a way of evoking that kind of what was actually there and what history you're trying to bring back towards perhaps even a different kind of future. So I would urge you to know that you're really good at making these forms, and then ask yourself, where am I making them, and for how long am I truly making them? And how can I let what I am trying to evoke through my architecture not be completely dominated by the forms that I've produced?
Thank you, Erin. I just want to, I think we have a few more minutes, and I wanted to make sure Harriet had a chance to say something if she'd like to.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, excellent comments from other jurors. So first of all, Ryan, thank you so much for sharing this work. I think at this stage in the project, really, two things need to occur in feedback. The first is, of course, an acknowledgement of all the hard work and a recognition of the strengths of your project, and then some, I think, enhancements, because radical redesign isn't really feasible. So first of all, I thought the visuals are compelling. I like the restraint that you evidence in the mixed media approach, and there's something tentative about that, which adds a reference to the way that you're viewing the site and the brief itself. I think the way that you show some form of storyboard regarding how one would approach the site and engage with it is really compelling. It makes it feel somehow relatable at a scale from a drawing anyway, and through the abstraction of Zoom. I think that you know, one of the challenges that you have, first of all, in dealing with a memory site is that we all necessarily have memories that in some ways manifest behaviorally in a similar way. But if this is a site that's got sensitive histories, then it will mean different things to different people. And at the moment, what you have as a thesis is almost antithesis, because there isn't really an actual architecture insofar as, in some ways, because there's no shelter. You get rained on, you're exposed, you're walking around a series of interventions that are folly-esque rather than necessarily architectural in the grandiose and an overarching sense. And that's interesting to me, this kind of way in which that you come to something which is a non-architecture in a way. But then again, what it operates as is a framing device on the embedded narratives within the site. And of course, I want to return to this point about your typological disruptions, because you talked a bit earlier about you've got these posts, and of course how you've given them their own typological naming, which is interesting. But I think that there's something intriguing about the idea that if this site is contentious, of course, then not everybody wants to walk around holding hands with children. They might potentially need other spaces to confront some of, if you like, the more challenging memories that they might have in relation to what this site symbolizes for many different groups within our society. So I think that's a really interesting point. I also thought, Professor Betsky made some really, really critical comments about engaging in many ways this almost kind of post-agricultural pastoral site that you've chosen. And of course, as a piece, memory is all about time, and time is very much around questions of growth and decay and decline. And so there's things, the materials such as coltan and how they respond to degradation. I think there may have been, I agree with the suggestion that there may have been other materials that would in some ways operate, I think, more in a more representational way about what memory is and how memory changes over time and for which demographic. I think also you heard earlier some excellent references, and I'll put some more in the chat in a moment, but I think you should be looking at Walter Hood's Black Landscapes as one example. I think that's a very relevant text for you. And I think also you talked a bit about necessary narratives, and I'd love to know, I'm much more interested in the unnecessary ones. Again, it comes down to the fact that, as an architect, you're in a way a curator, but you're not a director in terms of how people might engage. So I think there has to be some means to allow people to, if you like, have their own interpretive experiences, because they will be decidedly subjective, and are there necessarily enough environments to support a diversity of responses to a provocative history? And then, of course, I was thinking also about, Australia, because I live there for a year, and Luru, which you probably know is known as Ayers Rock by the colonialists, but the Kuris, as in the Aborigines, that to them is a sacred site. It's symbolic of a heritage. And what's so interesting about it is there's no choreography or curation whatsoever. It's just it's mass of space, where in a way what you're looking at, and this did come up in some of the other reviewers' feedback, was ability to kind of engage with an absence. You're dealing with a site of memorial, not just notions of a broader memory, but that it's this object or lack of an object, how this architectural curation frames particular qualities within the site. And then, of course, you're surrounded by this, come back to this point of, pastoralia in a way, all of these botanical and ecological dimensions that are in some ways very separate from the intervention that you're proposing, and could, I think, be much more engaged in some way in terms of how the structure might perform. At the moment it's functioning loosely as some kind of brise soleil, but beyond that it doesn't offer necessarily much shelter or necessarily much choreography regarding how one should potentially traverse through the site. So yeah, just to conclude then, I think that, you've got a latent environmental asset with the natural world around this site. You have opportunities to think more keenly about materiality. And I think also this notion of, behavioral responses to memory and loss and grief and all the provocations that come with it should not necessarily be so, presupposed to be quite necessarily the same across different communities. And I think there lies within that opportunities for having a differentiated series of spaces around people who respond in a reflective way, others who might potentially have a more emotive response and needing some form of comforting space in which to process those feelings. Anyway, I know that was my minute, so thank you. I better stop.
Thank you very much, Harriet. I think we've reached our time. Ryan, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you all so much as well.
And we really appreciate what you've done, and congratulations on your work. And the next person who is up is Charlie Culbertson, who's going to give his presentation. Charlie, are you here? There you are. I see you, Charlie.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. Am I okay to get started?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Marcia, I know you had, I apologize for not giving you a title. Throughout the semester, I've been using the title Aeolian Perception Chamber.
Thank you very much. I like that. It's very good. Thank you.
Okay. This project investigates how a perceptual understanding of place can be enhanced through the integration of natural forces in audiovisual architecture. Audiovisual architecture is a term I use to describe how the composition of sight and sound communicate to define spatial qualities, tectonics, time, and place. This is being studied through built means on a farm in Christiansburg, Virginia. On the farm, a structure has been arranged to give an alternate audiovisual perception of wind. The structure uses tension acoustic strings to relay the varying wind speeds through the harmonies at play. The tapered form takes advantage of the Venturi effect to increase the laminar flow of heavy north-south winds on the site. The form of the structure is designed to accept the slope topography and vertically fit within the scale of the trees. This site was chosen for its distance from disruptive noise and open rolling hills for the wind to freely flow. The obstacles of construction always challenged the original design intent, but with new challenges brought new solutions. This is partly why it was so important for me to bring these ideas to full scale. Also, the intensively detailed process of production and construction created an atmosphere of learning for all students and faculty involved. To get started in the process of construction and how these all relate back to the ideas of a perceptual understanding of place, the starting point was the surveying of the site, the digging and laying of the block. The ceramic block serves as a platform for an individual that is separate from the structure. The block was chosen for its ever-changing natural patina and its acoustic qualities. One's perceptive nature becomes more aware as they study the different shades and dimensions, or when their footsteps drum a different tune on each block. Following the block was the concrete and steel piles. The top of each column rests at ground level or even ground, horizontal. This is very important to emphasize the drastic grade change that exists on the site. Also, a rectangular steel member was cast into each cylindrical pile so the wooden columns could keep a safe distance from the concrete. Each column is made up of a pair of 2x4s that are spaced at 1.5 inches apart and connected along various center points by a metal spacer. This was an invention that arose because of wood's natural warping. The space column completely straightens and strengthens each member and allows for unique connections along the vertical axis. This is how the columns are attached to the rectangular steel. These columns also allow the north-south winds to flow through the structure. The sheet metal walls and roof serve the function of accelerating the north-south winds to the instrument. The entrance pulls the wind in with the oblique wall and curved roof, but sound will be amplified in the opposite direction toward the individual entering this form. Audiovisual architecture is achieved here. Spatial qualities, tectonics, time, and place are all understood through seeing how the wind moves through the space and hearing how it is relayed. The instrument serves the purpose of relaying various wind speeds into something a human can hear, making the invisible visible. Here's a recording of the latest instrument iteration. This consists of a steel resonating chamber surrounded by various tuned string. And I hope this isn't too loud. You may have to adjust on your side. The materials and products that make up the instrument can be seen serving other functions within the structure. This idea of altering the perception of everyday materials through arrangements was a starting point for my thesis. This was investigated through various models that tried to understand formal possibilities, various full-scale assemblages, and through investigating new means of representation. To end the discussion, I really wanted to emphasize why these ideas had to be investigated through built means. The perceptual understanding of place is best understood when an individual is able to develop their own observations. One must experience the relationship between audiovisual architecture and natural forces. Although wind has been the main force discussed, there are many unpredictable elements that have already altered the perceived environment. For example, how the weathering of a washer will continue to bleed down the structure, or how rust will slowly eat away at the smooth steel surface, potentially eliminating or altering the sound that the structure will make. This is best said in Peter Korn's Why We Make Things and Why It Matters. In the workshop, wishing won't make it so. The craftsman is forced to come to terms with physical properties of materials, mechanical properties of tools, and the real capacity and limits of his own dexterity, discipline, and imagination. In this way, crafts materiality imposes cooperation on the sometimes discordant factions of the mind. And with the completion of the structure coming soon, there's still many unknown outcomes, and the unknown is what fuels the excitement and dedication, and it has been throughout this year. Perhaps an individual who will stand in the structure will actually eliminate all the sound. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I leave this open to the reviewers.
Quick questions. That recording was made in the structure or not?
No, it's not.
Okay.
The instrument has yet to be installed, but will be soon. That was a recording right next to the structure. So the sound will actually be much different because wind is coming from all directions and not in a fluid motion.
What did you learn from your drawings? I mean, I'm a little privileged here because I've seen these drawings around the lobby, which is great. But I'm wondering how you feel those explorations, which are beautiful, have been reflected or have influenced the development of the instrument.
So I think even it comes down even to the question of thesis and architecture, and if exploring an idea really has to be, if it can be investigated through drawing or through the built means, which is better. And I think I had throughout the year had been taking the easy way out by showing involvement of wind in the project through audio recordings or videos. And in talking with Jim Bassett and other faculty, it was sort of evident that I never displayed wind throughout the project. So it was really difficult and really a fun challenge to try and represent this through drawing. And I think the drawing at the top is sort of the ideal conditions and for an individual to see, sort of trying to bring the emotion into the drawing too.
Charlie, I just want to say a couple of things here, just at the outset, which is that in this very virtual moment that we're living in and studying in, to be able to create a tactile expression of thesis in conjunction and in parallel with both the kind of intellectual provocation that you've taken on, and then the very elusive and very difficult thing, which is through modes of representation, trying to identify and invent really a new wind instrument. And so, I applaud you on trying to do the impossible in this, that is incredibly tactile in this very virtual world that we're in. Having said that, there are a couple of things that I'm very curious about, and I'm glad to hear in many ways that recording that we heard is in many ways a representation of a possible recording and that there is one to come in the future. What I was struck by is that your very opening image, which had the kind of cherubs in the four corners, arguably representing north, south, east, west, and the winds that those might be, made me wonder whether this thesis might actually grow over time and be positioned for four corners, for instance, rather than a singular structure. Because it seems to me that sound is very much about the world between spaces, or the production of something that happens because of the between, and you've created one instrument for that between. There's a composer named David Byrd. You should look him up, B-Y-R-D. He's very, very young. He's won more prizes than anybody under 30 that I know. But he's been working on the subject of sound and architecture, but without any training in architecture, but only with composing. And the piece that he's most famous for is two drummers at opposite ends of a theater, huge theater space, I believe it was outside of Paris, where they're drumming at exactly the same time, but it sounds as if the drum beats are about a second, 2 seconds apart, depending as they approach the middle line of the football field, the drummers are in unison. And through that simultaneity that sounds like it's not simultaneously, we understand the distance and the speed of sound, which is incredibly slow. And so it just seems to me that in many ways you've set the foundation for, I think, what Thesis can be, which is a lifetime of work that you continue to investigate. And it would be intriguing to maybe hear from you whether you think that the singularity of it is really in fact seminal to your thinking, or whether in fact this could multiply and amplify the narrative.
Thank you for the great comments. I definitely agree that this project could benefit more from more structures, or the four corners like you talked about, because this specific structure is specific to its exact location within the site. And the main idea of the project is to understand your surroundings. So I think that could be amplified even more with various structures that range in height, instrument types, to see how the site can change with these different installations. I think ideally, that's the direction I would have gone with time and other factors. Yeah.
That's helpful.
Charlie, thank you for the project. I think it does what Margarita had talked about in the beginning about maybe broadening what our definition of a thesis might be. And I love Marion's comments about thinking about things differently in the world that we're in this particular year, where the tangible has even more kind of complexity and depth to it as we understand things differently. I have a really simple question to ask, and that is that you talk a lot about perception and about the invisible. And as I'm looking at your drawings, most of those drawings are the representations of the thing that you built. And once you built that object, we can see that object and we can compare it to the representations that you made in preparation for building that piece, that instrument. But one thing that I'm really interested in is the value, or if you see any value in creating drawings that talk about the invisible, that are more about an idea of the ephemeral, the phenomena that you're creating. Because as you mentioned, how we perceive this sound depends on so many things. It depends on movement, distance, the humidity in the air. There are these phenomenal sets of patterns, right, that start to emerge through this instrument that you created. And part of me wants to, maybe it's the kind of data-driven side of me, but and also my kind of more poetic sense, I want to see that movement, that change, those shifts, and maybe to understand them, but also maybe to not understand them. You know, that maybe there isn't a correlation in changing the density of the wood members will increase the sound by such and such dimension, or the humidity factor, but also some unexplainable things, right, that might start happening with this instrument, where it's placed on the hill. And like you said, you might have different assemblies, different tests. Because I think what you're saying is that architecture can inhabit, and this idea of space can be thought of very differently than a physical inhabitation. And I think by kind of revealing those elements of the invisible, I think you make that narrative even more powerful. So, and perhaps you gain some measure, not of control, but of understanding of how we could shape that kind of auditory environment, right?
Mhm.
And how we might read our landscape around us, I think, which is even more important, in a more kind of sensitive, fine-tuned sort of way. So what are the bigger implications of those invisible drawings? I can imagine them as being incredibly beautiful, but can they do something more than just create another visual beauty, but rather can they inform us of the place that we inhabit, and help you in your decision-making as you move forward in thinking about what architecture needs to be?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I think this drawing here, the reason I'm not in love with it is because it only captures, I think, one of those many factors. The invisible factors are possibilities, and you know, there is still some time left in the semester, and I think it would be a great challenge to try and represent all those factors and how they could actually help me further understand the site or somebody else.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to map sound.
Mhm.
So, you know, it's like that kind of balance between like scientific, almost data-like inquiry versus kind of a perceived reading of what something is in abstraction. And, you know, that in-between space could be really fruitful.
Mhm.
Yeah, to follow up on that, the really great comments, Heather. I have to say what I keep longing for, and that was also my question about those drawings, is that in the process and also in some of the imagery that you showed us, some of the models you did, there was a much looser relationship to overall form. Yeah, I mean, it was a great example. There was much more of a sense of collage, of trying things out, of building things up one piece at a time or one connection at a time. And then in the end, we wind up with a rather rigid structure in which all the elements are the same. And as Heather already pointed out, you know, the beauty of a guitar or a violin is in fact the complexity of the shape that responds to its sound. It's very difficult to find an instrument that is not an electronic instrument that's a box, or that is configured in, you know, with that kind of complete equality of elements. And the same thing goes for the landscape. I mean, at the beginning of the presentation, we get your incision in the land, we get the sheep and the lambs in the background looking on. And then in the end, we get an artifact or an object sitting on the landscape, and the landscape is, again, like with Ryan's project, faded away, even though it was the generator in so much of it. And so if I had any advice to you, it was a little bit like what I would say to Ryan, which is you made the finished machine, now adapt it, adjust it, pull it apart. It needs some unbuilding or some unconstructing, I think, to bring out its real potential. And since you didn't do it in an accretionary way, as I assumed you would from your drawings and models, maybe you can achieve that kind of a complexity of responses, oral responses, landscape responses, formal architectonic responses, by a kind of decreeing or removal that might be able to get you there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, sorry to interrupt, but to respond to Aaron, I think, we had talked earlier in the semester about these images and how they are sort of don't have a program, but they still have the same ideas of responding to their environment and how they change that. And so maybe in a way, are you thinking that, so I have this built structure, and perhaps if I actually deconstructed it and attached new things in ways to purely just adapt to the landscape and how it will change over time, rather than serving the function of being an instrument?
Well, again, I maybe think of it as tuning the instrument.
Okay.
Tuning the instrument to the realities of the conditions you found, to the landscape, to the wetness in the air, to the bleating of the sheep, to the direction of the wind swirling, but also to the connections of the architectural elements. And perhaps I would hope to the knowledge that you gained about building such a large-scale instrument and the research that you've done, or I hope you've done, into the kinds of installation instruments of which there is a fairly rich history.
Charlie, just to add some comments to Professor Betsky's excellent observations. Well, first of all, I'm really intrigued by anything that tries to tackle questions of sensorial engagement beyond mere visual stimuli. And you've really tried to do that through these different kinds of experience, and that are evidently intended to obviously frame the context in which your project is situated, but offer different kinds of, if you like, sensorial experiences. And there's, in some cases, there is a lot of, I would say, separation from the site in some ways. And then in others, it's more exposed. So there's interesting contrasts. And I do appreciate the fact that you've also shifted media to include acoustic capture. I think one of the challenges, though, with doing anything, that's sensorially engaged is that, remember, any kind of sensual stimulus is about the absence of other senses. So it's about subtracting our ability to hear in some cases. Maybe that's a Faraday cage, something very easy you could add into one of these components. And times when it's perhaps very dark, so we're more attuned to the acoustic qualities within the site. So I think, remember, that's really how any form of sensorial engagement works. It's about the subtraction, not just the, if you like, enhancement of one sense over another. And of course, what I felt that I was expecting but didn't quite see in this was some form of, given that these elements are, have a precarity materially and structurally in some cases, and I like that. I like the fact that, architects are often, if you like, wrongly educated into assuming that architecture is an infinite, monolith to itself, rather than something that should, by rights, degrade or be intentionally self-destructive. And in some of these examples, you're dealing with something that will over time form some sort of degradation, and that's quite appealing to me. In one of the details I think you showed a moment ago, where you've got mesh wrapping around timber, obviously as the mesh degrades, it will leave a rust imprint on the timber, and I start to get really fascinated with what that might look like. And there's a possibility here for you to do some drawings that could add some you know, almost like map over time how you, in a future sense, how this site would degrade, what would be left. And we don't even need to start getting into the topic of the sixth mass extinction, but what would be left 5 years from now, never mind come the next environmental apocalypse. And that might be another way of telling the story of the material performativity. And actually maybe, I think, potentially post-rationalizing why you've got incongruous interfaces in some cases. I'm sure it was all very poetically intentional, but, you know, from as thinking as a sort of, you know, engineer briefly, I certainly see some challenges regarding some of these points of connection. And I think also coming back to this notion of the kinesthetic, which is, and the immersive, I was looking for more opportunities to feel that I could potentially interact with some of these forms and manipulate them potentially around my own ergonomic identity. You know, you have diverse users coming into this space. And so how might they reconfigure it around their individual needs, or how they might choose to use these devices as apertures on this landscape and the architectural experience that you're offering. And I think it comes down to, in some ways, it building in, and not, you know, because it's very easy to retro engineer because you've still got, you know, a little bit of time for final submission, these dimensions of interactivity that I think could in some ways offer some form of public engagement that borders on the co-authorship. So how every time you come to something, it's a bit like when you go to a playground and, you know, you see the kind of swings and the roundabouts left in a certain way, and you have an imprint of somebody else's past engagement. And there's something really alluring about that, you know. It's also terrible when you see it all covered in trash, but that's another story. But I mean, in this particular case, I think there's ways in which that kind of past user choreography and palimpsest that's generated through those forms of interaction could be really quite compelling, and how you might capture that within your drawing sequence. So yeah, just some general comments, but overall, you know, I think at this stage you've definitely got scope in response to all the other feedback as well to just add these details and embellishments to really take the narrative that I think you've, you know, constructed in a very sophisticated way to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Charlie. The next project is by Yasmine Katkhuda, and her project is on domesticity and post-colonial imaginaries. Are you here, Yasmin?
Hi, yeah. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So my name is Yasmin, and thank you all for being here. My thesis suggests rethinking domesticity at the juncture of architecture's entanglements with settler colonialism in a diasporic world. In the space between memory and material, this thesis is a non-hierarchical, anti-formal exploration on scenes of the ordinary, its conceptual linkages between the imagined or possible and the real or existing through collage as it is complemented by narrative. So traces of unfinished conversations and incomplete sentences cloud my memory as I think of home. Although being part of the Palestinian diaspora, it has always been an abstract concept. Longing to go home, we all speak of auda, or to return. But as Said says, and I quote, do we mean that literally, or do we mean we must restore ourselves to ourselves? Notions of home begin to exist in a void for imagination to fill. It holds fragments of stories untold by time, places lost in memory, and histories erased through politics. Return becomes a political act that is practiced at present and projected as an image into an uncertain future. The once displaced, destroyed, or forgotten becomes a story of existence, of resistance, and of belonging. So moving from the space of nostalgia that actively blurs, romanticizes, and questions notions of home, allowing for associative worlds and elements to come into relation with one another, as Vasily would argue, we enter the diasporic body space of dwelling set in a post-colonial landscape. Whilst the Palestinian landscape is not a post-colony in normative terms, and Membe argues for that as the historical trajectory of societies recently emerging from the experience of colonization and the violence which that inherits, the imaginary begins to push this like the boundary of this discourse as you speculate what a future of liberation could look like. And I can't talk about liberation and healing and belonging without situating myself within this contested history of forced displacement, of resettlement, which strips away any sense of dignity associated with dwellings as we see them and housing solutions proposed. And in parallel, how refugee camps have transformed over the years from more primitive forms of architecture to somewhere seemingly rhizomatic of permanence, where generations after generations inhabit like this constant state of temporary waiting to return. And so reorienting ourselves back into the imaginary, the encountered dwellings carrying a sense of memory of refugees past are superimposed into this junk space, a derivative of Koolhaas's writings. These buildings are in search of a reason to exist within this new network, as to which there is no inherent order. Composed of very ordinary buildings and bodies and stories, this junk space is concerned with domesticity and femininity as it is in its collective presence, as beyond the confines of simply the domestic. And in expanding the imaginary, encountered spaces of refuge, very ordinary structures within the Jordanian Palestinian landscape begin to surface in memory and in material. So what does a taking a section cut through that look like? Apertures begin to offer or begin to suggest an alternative future, alternative imaginary beyond, which lends to a first description of sight. Meant to be read from right to left as if you're reading in Arabic. To some 50 meters above sea level, wind from the Mediterranean carries the smell of Jaffa oranges eastwards, بيطفوا على ريحة الfumes escaping a military hardware manufacturing complex nearby, remnants of two houses belonging to a village past lying idle, domestic waste, a door, a column, a room without a roof, حائط الشباك, sunlight in a broken place, fragmented, layered in place, stuck in a cycle of healing, of waiting, still waiting, waiting, wanting, longing, remembering, rebelling, reclaiming, I yell, Ummi, I'm home, memory becomes her. And in searching, there is a clear instability in the idea of home, reminiscent of the inherited space within the diaspora, forced out of a luxury of forgetting, while being deeply immersed in it. So the building I encounter on my way home, past the checkpoint, the watchtower, and the orange tree, through the alley under the laundry in the orange sun, a building I encounter on my way home, an archive to stories lost in colonial modernity, traveling a long way from here. A building I encounter on my way home, in ruin, a beauty in fragments now whole, a strange feeling of longing still lingers here. A building I encounter on my way home, through cracked windows and unclosed doors, I enter what could have been but was not. A building I encounter on my way home, coexisting in presence and in absence, comes back to another imaginary. So spectators to their disappearance and destruction, three dislocated spaces of dwelling re-emerge as apertures to their subversive futures within this 250 meter squared post-colonial junk space that has its own traceable lineage of nostalgias and histories. These buildings, rooted in memory, in history, in colonial modernity, manifest in the imagination because of one another and not independent to each other, holding space for others to exist in the future. As these artifacts of memory and material come together, there is resolution in the impossibility of accessing home through a series of critiques on the architectures of settler colonialism. The dwelling of the diasporic body, based on the geometries of refugee housing proposals past, is now punctured with apertures through the limestone walls and zinc-clad roofs, bringing the imaginary beyond into the space of living within. Here, critical symbols of resistance, including the orange grove around, the sea in the distance, and the waste nourishing the soil, are framed. The second intervention is the archive to stories lost in colonial modernity. Inwardly focused cabinets of memory line the north and south walls, where carpets cover the floors and metal link curtains drape over the framed entrances to the archive. The space is imagined as the byproduct of collectivity filled with storage of time, displaying artifacts of memory and material, curating possessions, and idea borrowed from Palomina and cabinets. Lastly, in this post-colonial junk space is the uprooted watchtower. It's made accessible through a spiraling staircase and an elevator core. The diasporic body journeys to the top, arriving to the toilet room nestled within this cage. This post-colonial subject, the bathroom of the domestic space now superimposed with the watchtower of a colonial power, makes room for humor as a form of resistance and ongoing healing. the diaphoric body takes a dump on an artifact of colonialism, where here waste collected becomes productive to the soil and the story, both at once. And to conclude, in the space of healing through the imaginary, I search for home in all the wrong places, a confused duality in the superimposed reality, dwelling in the not yet here, the not yet there. Where do we go from now in a time of displacement, of disorientation, of reconstruct alternative realities in mundane scenes and post encounters, in ordinary exchanges? This memory is not neutral, this room is not neutral, and this discourse is never neutral. An impossibility of home emerges between. And thank you. And I look forward to any comments, questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Yasmin.
And yeah, also I can also go back to any slide. I know that was a bit fast.
That's great.
Two questions about the archives. It seems, I'm trying to figure out what a kind of anti-settlement architecture is. It appears as if it's something that is both monumental, but also attempted to be built out of local materials, but I don't want to assume. Is it made out of concrete block that is then stuccoed? And what does that mean? What does that say as a reaction to junk space? And then also, what exactly is archived? It seems like something very ephemeral is archived, and how does that archive then become a holder or a cherisher of that kind of ephemerality? And maybe interrelated questions.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could begin with the idea of the archive as this something, there's like an ambiguity as to which precedes the other, the inhabitant, like the passerby of this archive, the body that like goes through it, or the building itself, the archive itself. And I see these three interventions as like uprooted spaces from memory, from the imaginary, from existing sites that are left in ruin, now coexisting together in this junk space of waste, of they're not intentionally built. I'm not designing the watchtower, I'm not designing the archive, I'm finding these spaces, and with minor interventions with the cabinet as the main focus of an archive, that's how it becomes activated.
So these are actually found ruins.
Mm-hmm.
It would be great to have some imagery of that. Again, like in the other thing, your style of presentation is so beautiful and so complete that it's a little hard to find the elements, the landscapes. So those are the. So
yeah, they're encountered buildings.
Okay.
In travels, they're of a very traditional vernacular, local to the region. Yeah, rooted in a very like contested history, you could say.
But you're talking about, you're hypothesizing that these will be found, or these are actual places that you know of?
I mean, they exist in abundance.
Yeah,
and so it's taking that as like a symbol of something.
Right.
Taking the typical farmhouse as like a space of storing grains and so forth, right, as an archive to store your memories now.
Okay. It would have been great, but maybe this would have been too much to ask, especially in our current restrictions, if there could have been a kind of example,
mm-hmm,
a concrete example.
I mean, that's something I'll definitely consider for the book in documenting this.
Yasmin, I just have to, applaud the conviction of the poetry by which you've, in a sense, put us in a trance to be in the place that you are, to think about what this domesticity, post-colonial imaginaries means to you. And in many ways, I think what becomes very interesting in the kind of status of a poem as a thesis, and a thesis as a projection, you're in that liminal space, I believe, that somewhere between being, in a sense, so self-authored as to studiously keep us from the very things that, as Erin is touching on, might allow us to critique or enter that, that ambition that you have to keep it in the suspended state of something that is closer to writing, to text, to poetry than it is to architecture. And yet I think it's truly an architecture that you're trying to evoke. And so a couple of questions that come to me is, as you've described the elusive dream of home that can never be given measure, I think of Italo Calvino describing these invisible cities, which we all discover only at the end of the day turned out to be the very same city described through different lenses. And I think Erin's asked about maybe another lens, which might be the companion poem, if you will, that has tactile measure by which you have eliminated and subtracted certain aspects of it to foreground, say, the oranges and the smell of military smoke in conflict with each other to define the very nature of the place that you're trying to give measure to. I wonder whether there might be, if you will, tension and, if you will, a kind of projection of this thesis through a companion methodology that is not so hermetically artistic through words and the kind of beautifully crafted images that we see as collage, but as hyper-tactile, almost like the journalist or the reporter who's obligated to bring home 150 photographs for consideration in the Wall Street Journal. It seems that there could be, in a sense, a great revelation between seeing, as Italo Calvino did, so many different lenses by which the same place has been revealed. And I wonder if maybe you situated yourself so robustly in the poem that you've created that it could actually bear the friction of the counterpoint reality by which you've mined, as you've said, many watchtowers exist. Well, which one are you going to bring revelation to? Many sounds exist. Which one are you going to record and give a home to? Because it feels that you have begun and completed, in a sense, this incredible, if you will, short story. And that short story has now situated you to consider some chapters that might actually take on even more architectural, the architectural problematic, which I think you have touched on, but maybe delayed an engagement with.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for all these great comments. Calvino's writings has been one of my precedents early on, and just like reading very different like writings of his, but also something closer to home of poetry of like Mahmoud Darwish and thoughts of like Noura Akawi on territory and Saad Amri on like history. So there's a lot of precedents that have like prefaced this like line of research and design. And I do think I've maybe delayed the actual act of like detailing a wall section in my watchtower, you know, or the actual like tectonics of these spaces, because they exist in the imaginary, because they exist in a memory that is complemented by the writings and the poems that make you imagine. I don't need to tell you there's a tree here, but you can imagine that a tree exists here, or the smell that that carries and covers of both like the fumes and also the waste that is being collected in the soil. So yeah, thank you for your comments.
But I think you're avoiding it a little bit in the way that you're also avoiding the kind of development that I think Marion was also asking for. I don't think we're asking for wall detail. I certainly wouldn't be, and I don't think Marion would be either. I think what we're asking for is some sort of instantiation or perhaps even entombment of the evocation of the fantasy of the nightmare that all might be wrapped up in this. It remains at the level of floating images without diving in, to use and this is one of the reasons why, quite frankly, I can't stand Calvino. I think he should be banned from architecture schools for 5 years because everything remains so much on the surface. And as soon as you get some sense of an image, it's on to the next one, and everything is very kind of sweet in a way. And that's the kind of paradox of this project, is there's almost a sweetness where you're dealing with very serious issues. And I think what that might call for is, in fact, the kind of delving in, the kind of going down the rabbit hole in a way that those images would enfold you, would become more harrowing in a sense, would become, put their teeth or their talons into you more. And that's one of the things that architecture can do. That is, poetry gets its talons into you through another set of mechanisms. And architecture can put its teeth into you and force you to reckon with something exactly with its kind of thickness and its refusal to flit away when you close your eyes and shake your head. Its ability to, its refusal not to be present. And there's something about that's very much implied in your drawings. And I think that's why, and I hope I'm not over-interpreting Marion, but I think why both Marion and I are so hungry for it, because it's at the tip of your pencil, so to speak, or your keyboard in those drawings. They're amazingly evocative and beautiful. And then they flit away and they disappear to the next thing. And I think we're looking for that. Getting that.
I think I've struggled with that as well, but it's also, it echoes the notion of being in the diaspora. You're constantly in flux, always searching for something more. And that like sort of embodies my thesis, maybe.
Then I think you could have, that might have led to another set of even tectonics of the way in which images or memories of home become a real architecture through photographs that we have or drawings that we do from memory, and that become closer to art that is made. And I know there's some fantastic work going on in the diaspora in terms of trying to evoke in weaving and clothing and the kind of images that come out of those memories, spatial and formal anchor within that. And so I think if it was about those fleeting images, then there's a way for it to be about those fleeting images that would again get them to become more present for us.
Erin, you've just, I think, brought up something that Yasmin, I think you might want to look at very closely. The artist Doho Su, who owns as many sewing machines as I do, has taken upon himself to actually replicate full scale a series of places, including his grandmother's, by using parachute silk and sewing in great detail, including even the conduit on the walls and the bags that might be on the floor, all through the same monolithic and sheer fabric, so that you can walk through them, but also see through the walls, even when things like an outlet sticks out from the wall, crafted ridiculously well through a sewing machine. And in many ways, that act of Doho Su to give measure to the specificity of something, yet retain through its restraint of material choice, a sense of its ephemerality, in many ways, I think is probably as resonant as it can be while it still needs to be protected indoors. It's not fit for being outside. And that's where I think this question of what the diaspora is, where you choose to represent it, suggests to me that it should be anywhere but in Palestine that we would experience the poem that you are trying to give us measure with.
I'm sorry, do you want to respond and I'll add some comments?
We might, yeah, I mean, you can go ahead, I can.
Oh, okay, great, Yasmin. Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. It's actually fascinating to me to be able to re-engage with conversations around Palestine. It's a deeply sensitive site to pick, and bravo to you for doing so. I mean, my concerns about the drawings are really that, they could be considered, if one is being cynical, a form of architectural obfuscation, because they are intentionally ambiguous and therefore in some ways exonerate themselves of the need or the obligation to articulate some really kind of hard matter relative to the site and also politically to the themes that you're tackling. At best, of course, we could argue that they're all about the sublime and the subconscious, but even you know, we do spend a big part of our day awake. So I'm all for, you know, having these sublime and subconscious renderings, but would love to know on a kind of tactile and material level what this really is. And I think it started making me think a bit about what, you know, my experiences of visiting Israel and Palestine, and thinking about two of, I guess, preoccupations I have if I'm thinking, coming back to these, I think in some ways what subliminality tends to evoke, which is this, you know, again, coming back to this questions of sensoriality. You know, what are the two kind of critical issues relevant to this site? For me, I mean, water, for one, as you know, in Palestine, coming back to a conversation earlier in the feedback about oranges, we touched very briefly, as you know, they're called shamuti. And, you know, the interesting thing about oranges, of course, is that these groves were previously developed by Palestinian farmers and then became Israelis, or kind of, if you like, taken over by the Israelis, and then became the Jaffa orange, which, you know, coming from England, was obviously boycotted historically for many, many decades. And I'm really interested in, you know, this idea of just almost taking as a point of departure this object, this orange, and thinking about it, because, you know, one of the interesting things, as you'll know, is that water is routinely cut off from Palestinian communities. And obviously that devastates their lands to the point that they are economically unviable, at which point it's much easier then to seize the land. So there's some interesting kind of tensions around access to the resources to maintain farming and agriculture in the tradition of the region. And then, of course, oranges themselves, I think, you know, because I'm trying to sort of connect in some way some of, you know, these drawings are great, but I would love to see the sort of rawness of an orange, the sort of, you know, it's a bitter thing, it's a sweet thing, it's sticky, but they're obviously politically incredibly symbolic. But I think, you know, there's something in that about it, almost like this, how this orange journeys through this particular site, or it engages in the sites you're talking about and its lifespan and what that means materially. And of course, the other thing besides the water that it does and doesn't have access to, you know, the many fences and the many concrete walls that exist around that community. So you've kind of got, in some ways, a landscape where there's these, if you like, interventions which are all about control and occupation, and in many ways colonization and segregation, and even, as you probably read this week, apartheid, which is the new claim regarding the relationship between the two communities or nations, one might argue. But I think that all of these materials, which are on one level really symbolic in a negative way because they're all about these forms of segregation and oppression, have, you know, a kind of flip side to them. You know, we see concrete as actually a fairly positive thing in many architectural renderings outside of this context. So I think there's something really interesting about how, if you are going to give this a more, you know, conspicuous material rendering in your final drawings, I would start thinking about, you have, you know, these materialities available to you, and you've obviously started to work with them in really interesting ways. But I would push you further to kind of somehow bring them into much more palpable form of rendering. And there's just something interesting to me about the way in which, you know, we often use the user, I suppose, and the kind of journey through a site to tell a particular story about an architectural experience, but we don't always have to. We could be post-human about it and think a bit about the journey of an orange, or at least the lifespan of an orange. And I think that there's some dimensions to this if you want to have a kind of both a far more conspicuous and, one might say, authentic and immediate and materially conspicuous form of rendering for these drawings, is to start, you don't have to necessarily populate it with people, you could populate it with other objects such as oranges. So just some suggestions about how you might somehow bring this to earth in a quite a literal sense, but also thinking about, and I'm sure you can look this up because you do reference your research a lot, the timetables when water's cut off and when it isn't. It's very, very scheduled. So people have to like fill up water containers for hours on end and then drink from those for hours on end. And it's not strictly speaking about whether or not there's enough water, it's all about forms of control. So there's something really interesting, again, that you're dealing with a site that's got all these contrivances around when things are turned on and off, whether that's electricity or water, and also the relationship of water to this site. So again, to bring it to earth is to connect it to some of the kind of absences, and then obviously the presence of things like water and how they relate. Sorry, so next to a police station in Brooklyn, you know. That was just the police getting really enthusiastic about your project, but I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for these. And I didn't have time to go over all these like symbolic things that you do mention and very, you know, you do bring up, which are very obviously important to my project. So yeah, thank you for mentioning these and for your
Yeah, I just want to strengthen, I know we're almost out of time, but Harriet just raises a really important point, which is the kind of environmental devastation of Palestine. You know, I got myself in a lot of trouble in Jerusalem giving a lecture about how even when the political problems are solved in Salah, the environmental devastation will last for thousands of centuries, thousands of years, because it's been going on for thousands of years. And it is the means of exercising power even more than the gun in a deep way. And part of your image was in fact about, as Harriet said, the absence of that orange, that the orange tree is being cut down and settlements have been built, and some sense of that kind of rootlessness, which you started off with, needs, I think, some readdressing of the landscape. Again, I've said it now in the last all three of these projects, but a readdressing of the landscape and a reinscribing, in this case, because of perhaps the impossibility of doing that, I think is really important.
Yasmin, I just want to add at the end that your project is very beautiful and provocative. I think it's important, it's timely. And looking at your drawings, though, I just want to reiterate some comments that have been made in different forms. I think Harriet's comments were extraordinary kind of feedback for you. But the idea of a montage or a collage and how you employ that, historically, in many examples, they often involve distortion or they involve political content, because they really want to challenge the viewer in terms of how you read a situation. And yours sometimes send me to a place of, oh, that's a beautiful image, and I'm trying to recollect and put together kind of artifacts, right? But they don't necessarily push me as hard as I think you can push, because you have such a contentious space, and the histories are complex, they're tactile, they have all the right elements to make those montage collage elements really come to life. And you can distort something, like it doesn't have to be a recollection of a memory or an artifact that's true, because in the act of distortion, I think it's like using humor or using distortion, you're pushing on our consciousness, and you're also pushing on our known histories and making us doubt what we know and rethink the situation. And I think that that's really important. And if I have more time, that's where I would want your project to go. I don't know that it needs to be a building. I think of Hayduk's Victims, the book that he made, which is about the site of the Gestapo, but it's all about time, and his is much more structured than I think maybe you want to explore. But I think that it's a valid, again, pointing to these projects being chosen as thinking about architecture in different ways. You know, does it have to be built, or could it be a set of narratives? And your poems, I just wish I had more time to read them again and again, because I think that there are things in there that I was only able to capture the overall emotive quality, but I think you chose your words very carefully. I was picking up on it incrementally. And I think that that needs to be unpacked, and that you need a structure to present this project. And it could be that it's on Zoom and therefore we're just going image to image to image. But I feel like there's something in the creation of a book that gives you the space for kind of the narrative, the poetry, maybe even the analysis and the histories, and different forms of writing and different forms of collage and montage and structure, I think would also help bring your project to the next level. I'll close there. But thank you, it was beautiful work, thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Yasmin. Then I feel terrible, we just rushed to the next one, but this is Carolyn Kerr, whose is The Art of Memory. And while she brings her work up, I just want to remind everybody to check the chat. There have been a number of comments that I think are really relevant, and so just check them when you're done with your presentation. So that's just for instance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcia. I hope you all can see this and hear me. My name is Carolyn Kerr, and I'm going to continue in this discussion it seems like we're having this morning about memory and discuss some thoughts on the art of memory. Our present moment is all at once connected physically, mentally, and emotionally with past events and spaces. Memory and architecture are both constructed from images and deeply dependent on them. They build a framework through which time and space can be defined. The purpose of my thesis is to understand this connection to place, specifically the city of Pittsburgh, to experience and amplify these layers of time, and to build an architectonic lens through which program can continue in this expression of creation through a community arts collective. Memory is experienced not in a linear fashion, but in episodic conditions. These short, memorized, slowly layered depictions of space and time. Memory moves from the perimeter inwards, recollecting activities, constructs within the room, and artifacts last. A fascinating piece in memory research is the fact that with this fragmentation, it's also malleable. Our memories can be changed by our emotions surrounding a particular place or event. During this recollection, our bias may fill in the gaps. This is what researchers are now calling reconsolidation. The common origin of the mind is a collective. Carl Jung speaks about this in archetypes, these universal inherited instincts and impulses. There are stories that we have made a part of our lives. Archetypes evolve and change, but in the essence, the mind has a history too. I'll be focusing in Hazelwood, one of 90 neighborhoods in the city of Pittsburgh. Hazelwood was deeply impacted by the uprooting of the steel industry, containing shells of this industry along the Monongahela River. Hazelwood contains one of the last undeveloped brownfields in the city. The 178-acre Hazelwood Green has two existing structures, Mill 19, which has recently been developed into a lab for Carnegie Robotics, and the Monongahela Connecting Railroad Roundhouse, of which I would like to focus. The Hazelwood Green was owned and operated by J&L Steel, one of the only steel companies in Pittsburgh never bought out by Carnegie. The two important dates here are 1887, the year the roundhouse was built, and 1998, the year it was abandoned. In the 134 years it has been standing, the only consistent architectural elements are the turntable and the radial roundhouse. The building was constantly being added onto. Structures popped up wherever and whenever necessary, all based on the latest technology. The most accurate site plans come from 1950. The structure was simply created for the turning and fixing of a stationary linear vehicle. The radiality of the building and the interaction with the turntable is obvious in the presence of the tracks, but as it currently stands, this connection is ghosted. My initial curiosities about the site were along the lines of the circularity of the roundhouse and how this could be echoed throughout. The shell sits in an abandoned field with not much to dictate its form. The building comprises a few important elements: the 65-foot turntable, the machine shop addition from 1950, steel roof trusses, and the roundhouse proper. That is an uninsulated building with triple-layered brick walls and a double-column front facade. There's a high base base and a low base base. They raised the roof when they moved from steam to diesel locomotives. These are some site images from visits noticing small details about the space and the palimpsest of brick. This building was created strictly for locomotives, not humans. This question of scale led to research of the exact locomotives that J&L Steel had owned during their tenure. The locomotive volumes proposed in the roundhouse are sized approximately to the dimensions of the steam and diesel ones owned by J&L. The locomotive volumes are placed throughout the space in a respectful opposition of where they once stood. Similar to the work of Carlos Scarpa, memory is better understood through a newness that opposes and separates itself from the old. Out of necessity, the roundhouse was only a quarter of a circle. In an effort to enclose the entire circle, the locomotive volumes are extended to the outside of the shell, where they're fractured, unearthed, and altered. The locomotives stand as a living gallery. This architecture of walls balances in the line between studio and art gallery. The approximately sized locomotive volumes are placed frivolously throughout the space, creating oblique artist studios between. The approximate volumes within the shell serve as storage and service spaces for the artists, while the altered volumes on the exterior serve as classrooms and workshops. To enhance the unique lighting conditions inside, holes were poked in the roof surface, indicating that there is something new happening inside of this building. Each studio is given a particular shape and size of light tube or skylight. This is an expression of a particular medium's need on the exterior of the shell. The sculpting studio has one large direct skylight, while the painting studio has multiple sources of indirect light tailored to that specific medium. More indirect light dots the ground in the studio during the day. In the evening, the polycarbonate volumes glow from the inside and express the structure of the interior. The rear elevation of the roundhouse has multiple large openings that serve as a sort of palimpsest of the original additions. Each of these openings is relined with a deep metallic extrusion. The depth of these frames creates an archaic visual appearance. The extrusion itself is separated from the original frame and comes to a sharp point, suggesting that this metal has been forcefully cut through the shell. The facade of the roundhouse is extended past the two original layers of columns, creating a third facade. These revolving plain wing-like doors continue in this expression of circularity in the building form. These massive revolving doors are clad in a vertical recycled corten. The vector piece is covered in a green wall to protect the original steel frame and permit the locomotive volumes to peek through. The Hazelwood Green is registered as an Act 2 site due to its history of active dumping and steel runoff. This title requires that any soil moved during construction not be taken away from the site. This provides an intriguing opportunity to utilize this soil and create an echo of the roundhouse form. These earthen depressions throughout the site disperse in a sound wave-like manner, as if there was a sort of sonic impact from the construction of the roundhouse. Upon approaching the site by either 2nd Avenue or Blair River Road, there is a visual connection of nearness to the roundhouse, based on the height and density of the mounds of earth. The differentiation of old and new architectural elements and their collaboration toward a new redirected whole is an approach to a formation of memory through architecture. It allows space for stories and layers of the past and present to enter into a common dialogue. The preservation of the important parts of the roundhouse, together with the new insertions, constructs a revived story. This new life in the roundhouse proposes a reading of the collective history of the site in reverence and respectful opposition. Collectively, they create new layers of images along with that of the original context. A building can be preserved only if it is first understood, not just as a singular general history, but understood in its plural history, its layers of moments in time that have impacted the space. Architecture has the power to become a tangible experience of history. The neighborhood of Hazelwood has a rich history in the golden age of steel that put Pittsburgh on the map. This shell of brick and mortar has a spirit of industry beneath it that as an experience occurs through these layers. This realization of memory in architecture will occur through the preserving of the historic shell, inserting a new order and form that will respectfully oppose the old, and reattaching the architecture to the new Hazelwood Community Arts Collective. Thank you so much for allowing me to unload some ideas on the art of memory. I'd love to now open this up for questions and further discussion.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.
Harriet, Heather, Marion, Erin.
Why do I always have to go first? What the program seems very loose and very just small, and I'm wondering why that is, and it's kind of ironic because your last image shows the building somewhat overwhelmed. in a way that I didn't get from the previous thing. So I'm trying to figure out both. You seem to be rather ambivalent. On the other hand, you're very delicate about what you fill it with. And I think that maybe just from a first looking at it, it might be too little. And then on the other hand, I very much appreciate your landscape gestures, but between that and all of the steel, it seems like kind of overwhelming what's left of the building. And you had those great images of the brick and how beautiful it was. And again, I'm sort of looking for that in the end.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the programmatic elements of the site, that's a very that's a very interesting comment. Just the intentionality with which I discussed. I felt like I considered the program as a sort of vehicle for this memory, this recreation. The artist is, I'm creating a space for an artist to recreate, and there's a beauty in what an artist does. And so I felt that the space needed to reflect that individuality, that recreation, the layers of time and history. And I think with your comment about it being small, there are plans for the Hazelwood Green. It is being developed at the moment. And the city of Pittsburgh has a history of forgetting its residents in the face of progress. And the neighborhood of Hazelwood, as I said, deeply impacted by the uprooting of the steel industry. That the Hazelwood Green is not, if you discuss with the residents about it, it's not a space that they want to be this new developed infrastructure. I think that proposing it as an artist collective in a community space is really intentional in that way, to create a space where it would give back to the neighborhood. So
I'm not arguing with that, although I must say from my memory of that site, it's rather isolated from the actual neighborhood. And so the argument that it's kind of amenity for that particular neighborhood, given its particular location, I would have some questions about. But my point is more that you make these boxes, which, by the way, in those configurations are not the most usable studio or display spaces. They're too narrow, quite simply, to really work. And then you insert them rather delicately. You leave a lot of space there, and yet I'm not seeing in any of your drawings the kind of love and respect that you're mouthing, that you're expressing in your words for the existing building. The building again fades away. The brick, the presence of the streaks of oil that I assume are there. I'm looking for that to remain more present. I mean, I would, and for me, it's almost symbolic the way that the roundabout, which, as you said, was the whole reason for this building, has now become this kind of garden element. And I would have just put a locomotive there or something that really anchors that space, because it is the anchor space that defines the logic of that building. And it feels like it needs that kind of an anchoring.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing point.
Carolyn, I was struggling a little bit with the project in terms of a recommendation, not in terms of your work, but in terms of a recommendation, because I too lost Pittsburgh a little bit, and the history. So the final image threw me, and then I thought, oh, maybe I missed something in the presentation, because it felt like it was in a completely different landscape. I haven't been to Pittsburgh in a number of years, so perhaps, it has changed considerably. So that's where I was a bit stuck. as you talk about memory and place, and you make these interventions into the building, and you talk about some materials being kind of new and inserted and kind of respecting the original form of the roundhouse, I think something that I'm looking for is those kind of elements that you've inserted, right? Like the windows or the skylights or the big movable doors that you have in the front, and how they relate to maybe a bigger idea of the roadhouse structure, and how it was mechanized, or how it reflected an industrial, kind of Rust Belt cities, post-industrial, and then the transition that Pittsburgh has undergone, which is pretty remarkable. But I didn't hear you talk about that with any specificity, even though you've taken this existing structure and you've said primarily, and I could be reading the project a bit wrong, but that it was about these insertions of new kind of, for lack of a better word, elements, right, that plug in. And then for me, the artist quarters are, they're symbolic because they're in the dimension of existing cars, right, that would have used this. So to Erin's point, it really just takes the existing car, uses its dimension, and puts it as an object inside. And I'm really struggling with the interpretation between what it means to be an artist, commenting on the changes that Pittsburgh has undergone and is going through currently, and how that serves as a space of activation rather than a museum of kind of, I want to call recreation. Because I think by inserting artists in there, you made it different than a museum. You made it an active kind of space where people want to take action and they want to affect change. I think artists have many roles to play in our society, and yet they're set in this sort of bucolic, kind of landscape at the end, and I see maybe gardeners in the final rendering, and so I'm really struggling with the kind of program, which has a lot of potential to it, the kind of way in which you treat a historical building, which initially I find really interesting, but I'm waiting for like how it expresses itself in the material and the detail. And then where is Pittsburgh in this narrative? I want to know more about the city and more about how we can impact the city through this project that is bringing a different group of people together. So I just, that's my delay, is I have a lot of questions. I don't necessarily have a fixed recommendation of where you might go next. But I do think these cities, especially Rust Belt cities and other cities, and Pittsburgh's transformation happens in phases. And I am not an expert on Pittsburgh, on the city. But I think that history is absolutely fundamental to your narrative. And I would love to see more drawings about the city and about this history and its relationship to where it's going in the future.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. Yeah, I apologize that it was like confusing in any way, but or overwhelming in that way. But yeah, I think that's a piece of this that could be introduced far more, that respect of the city of Pittsburgh itself. I think there's a little bit of an ode to it in the recycled Core 10, in the way that I'm implementing these things. And I think Pittsburgh has a history of the reviving of particular neighborhoods happens with artists first. Yeah, and so I think that this was an intentional effort in that way. Yeah, but thank you for your thoughts, Heather.
Any other comment? Oh, sorry, Harriet.
Yeah, I don't mind adding a few comments. And I think, honestly, the other critics have done a really good job. And I don't want to add too much, to be honest, because I wouldn't want to overwhelm, because I think a lot of the feedback has been very instructive on, in some ways, some of the areas where there could be, I think, additions made or clarifications made in relation to the drawings, and potentially, I think, to some extent, the intentions and the ambition of the project. From my perspective, I think, gosh, Pittsburgh, like the others, perhaps I've limited understanding of the city. I don't believe I've ever visited it. But what I do know a bit about is that obviously architecturally, it's very interesting. It's, naturally understood to feature as part of the Rust Belt. And I know you mentioned Courtenay, and I know, just to say generally, and a message to all students across the entire universe, we are a bit bored of hearing about Courtenay in design projects, just a memo from professors and deans. So I think what's interesting though is that, if you think about what a deconstructed car is, and obviously Pittsburgh had a reasonably robust automobile industry and manufacturing base, which has been in decline, which also is why the city is losing population. A bit like Detroit, I suppose, which is an advanced example of what Pittsburgh potentially is becoming. You have a situation where, if you like, one identity replaces the former one. So you may or may not know this, but in Detroit, traditionally people came from the South after, all the slavery laws were abolished, and they moved to where they could find work. And obviously Rust Belt was a huge draw because a lot of the work relative to production line wasn't necessarily highly skilled. But what they brought with them was an incredible amount of agricultural knowledge, which is why in the case of Detroit, it's become one of the fastest and actually most successful examples of urban farming, because they brought this agricultural knowledge that kind of skipped a couple of generations and is now becoming incredibly useful to the repurposing of that city's template. So I think, first of all, what you have is archaeologically some really intriguing buildings. Obviously, there's some infamous architects who've made contributions to this space when it was prosperous. But you've got all these different typologies too. It was a city that had and still has many skyscrapers and theatres and other things that typologically leave you with, I think, some kind of residual imprint about potentially the kind of the scale, but also the performativity of the city and its heritage. And I think maybe that there's a kind of clue as to what your building could do in terms of its, ambition programmatically. How much more ambitious could the spaces be in relation to some of these residual identities the city once had, as its more distinguishing characteristics. And of course, the materiality of the degrading city. I would love to see how, in quite a literal sense, some of the, if you look at the work of, Belgian architects Rotor, which is ROTOR, they have this wonderful thesis, which is that, it's fine to build, but you have to deconstruct first. So they go and strip down buildings and then they reconfigure the building into a new thing, which is incredibly ecologically as well as financially responsible way to operate. So I'm really interested in how one might repurpose bits of these declining infrastructures, materials and forms within what you're trying to do to just add some kind of, I think, contextual sort of strength to this project relative to all of this, urban materiality and what it really offers you. And that's not necessarily a departure from the project as is. It's about, I think, adding in information about, and it may be a little bit of discrete retro-engineering that all along you intentioned to make this out of this detritus. So why bother actually, Courtenay is an artifice, it's intentionally and strategically aged steel when actually there's plenty of rusting steel in Pittsburgh. Why bother spending a lot of money on Courtenay? So, I think that you could work more closely with, in a parasitic way, and it might be a lovely drawing to have if you were to think about the degradation and which sites. I mean, I know Detroit very well, but I don't like Pittsburgh, but I'm sure you'll be able to figure out, what are the key industrial buildings that have collapsed or failed. I'm sure you'll be able to get photographs, think about what their materials are, and then think about how you could, in some ways, appropriate them into the structure of and the material form of your expression, which is this, one could almost call it a sort of zombie building or an afterlife, a sort of Lazarus of Pittsburgh. It just, I think, would add in for you a whole narrative dimension to this, and a strategic, environmental and economic integrity to the project, which I think just would allow this somehow to feel less like, at the moment, ironically, and it is obviously in some ways circular and reminiscent of, 1970s sci-fi renderings of spaceships from, Mars, etc. But there is something alien about what you're doing in a funny kind of way. So I think, how do you actually kind of work beyond that if you're going to do a form that doesn't necessarily feel that it's being driven by a thesis that necessarily feels Pittsburghian, if that's a thing, then maybe it's less about redesigning this and more about reconsidering its actual mass, like what's it made from, and how can that tell different stories? And even how can that also, in the kind of seduction of the palimpsest and the patterner, give you a whole other series of visualizations that really start to make this feel ostensibly a hallmark building, a signature building and in some ways a kind of memorial to a city who's transpositioning between one, if you like, form of industrial identity and into another. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Harriet. Those were really, really intriguing comments. I think what you're bringing up is that, you know, in my thesis, I'm talking about these layers of history and looking back, and that those layers together creating the present moment. But what you're mentioning is what the future moment would look like. So what is that future layer? Like, what will this building look like if it continues to degrade? And will it just be the locomotives? Will it just be the walls? What will be the understanding of the building then? It's really, that's intriguing. So thank you.
You know, Carolyn, I've been listening to these comments and I really kind of appreciated hearing prior comments, because I've been struggling trying to figure out how to enter the thesis that you began with, which was this extraordinary site and this kind of extraordinary legacy that has over 100 years left a city that was thriving and had purpose-built, you know, structures that were tied to the kind of industry of that which was being extracted and then shipped and then distributed around the country. And so these were artifacts tied to the things that made it a powerful city. And now they've lost their power to produce that, and they are artifacts that remain that you're now thinking about re-inhabiting. But what I struggled with was at every turn when you chose to insert or add, there was a multiplication of new elements that didn't necessarily find tension or engagement with the existing structure itself, or identify a hierarchy of that which would be leveraging, say, the existing arc of display versus these smaller elements, which I think I agree with Aaron would be hard to imagine being good for art display or art production. Similarly, the kind of the panels that we see sort of inscribing the edge, the idea of the kind of perforated ceiling, the displayed walls of Core 10 that migrate out in the landscape. Each thing felt like they were done one at a time and one thing after another, rather than one thing because of another. And if we could think about one thing because of another, I think the first because is the beginning of the artifact of the structure that you found. The second because, which I think Harriet refers to, is the deeper legacy of why it's here and why there's no more strength, if you will, that remains in the kind of engine that Pittsburgh held initially. And so if we were going to think about the one thing because of another, the third one then is the artists who are going to recast this site for something that maybe brings something new to focus. And unlike Harriet's sort of interest in being able to kind of evoke that legacy of what is lost in Pittsburgh, I would maybe say one would need to be very intelligent in your own mind about whether that is indeed what you'd like to intensify and amplify, or in fact, reinvention is what you want to intensify and amplify. And so I think that what I so appreciate, and that's why I think this thesis project has so much promise, is that you are giving value to a history and a memory. You are giving value to a structure that could be seen as if it has no more value yet to be kind of reconceived. And in fact, you're looking at art, which is a place of invention, as a way to re-inhabit and recast this ghost, to turn it into something that has a new present without completely eradicating or obliterating the past. You said no earth can be removed from the site, I'm assuming because it has contamination. Yes. But one could argue that when we think about contaminated sites, and we've done a lot of work with contaminated sites, the thing that you can do, which is quite intriguing, is dig away and pile it back up for new effect as long as it stays on site. But something else needs to reclad that soil if it's going to do something else. And it might be interesting to think about that which you need to add that wasn't there for new reasons, because in fact art is at stake. So I guess I applaud the ambition, and I would hope that as you sort of move forward as an architect, the possibilities of intensification can be more, in a sense, more focused rather than more numerous.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for those comments, Marion.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for all the comments, everyone. And again, please take a look at the chat. There's some very good comments there. And so the next project is Graham Park's project, and it is Mindfulness Through Making. Graham, are you here? There you are.
Yep. Yeah, I had a little glitch. It wouldn't let me interact with the Zoom, so I had to jump back in and out. But
You're here though.
yeah, thanks for letting me back in. Well, thank you all for coming. I'll go ahead and get started. Oh, oops. All right. My thesis explores how mindfulness achieved through the act of making can deepen the relationships between self, object, architecture, and sight, at a time where the value of a crafted object comes as much from the integrity of its creation as its immediate utility. In the beginning, I was focused on making objects as a means to reflect on how I approached the craft of woodworking. This gave me opportunities to ask myself how I was using the material, what properties were I responding to, and how could I elicit more questions from these objects through sketching, photography, or more iterations. At the same time, I was reading into conversations had by other craftspeople, architects, and writers who explored the embedded experiences or memories within an object. These conversations provided powerful perspectives on our kinship with the objects we make, and how their presence in a space is a small but essential component in our ability to inhabit a place fully. In order to expand my own conversation with the objects I was making, I began exploring the quietness of the Grayson Highlands State Park and Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. Trekking through its deep forested gullies to its high mountain meadows, I discovered sites that might create dialogues of place by introducing a building and object. These excursions into the park have provided the framework for my thesis project in the form of 3 kinds of shelters along the trails of the park. My first shelter began at Cabin Creek. This trail ascends alongside a cascading stream in a gully below Wilburn Ridge. I'd come looking for the waterfall at the end, but was surprised to learn that this creek was stocked with brook trout. This was revealed by examining the small fishing shack away from the bank, but I began to wonder if there was a more meaningful way to connect to the creek. I started with a bench as a place to fix a line or simply to come and rest. I had carved a surface that rippled in light like the water, and by floating the top away from the edges of the legs, established a relationship that would translate to the deck of the new shack with its structure. The difficulty moving forward was resolving the site with the shack I had proposed. To move past this, I kept going back to the detail, each time trying to create a more intimate connection with the material I was building on and being more sensitive to the material I was building with. A roof of tin became woven vines, and steel footers became scorched timbers that would swell into stones. And the steps that would choke the path down to the creek were removed so the shack could cover a person as stones delivered them to the water. The second shelter is situated 5 miles away among the trees of the Elk Garden section of the Appalachian Trail. Here I enjoyed hiking under the canopy, seeing light filter across the trunks of trees, but by the end of it, I was looking for a place to rest. This thought inspired a stool that would make, for taking off your boots at the end of a day of hiking, while also making it easier to put them on the morning after. As I began to cooper the curve of the seat and tie the spindles of the undercarriage together, I used the gesture completed by these 2 systems as a basis for a small shelter hoisted among the trees, a mechanically similar tensile structure with a ruddy canvas tarp that might flutter along with the treetops. As I climbed to the top of Wilburn Ridge, I knew immediately where I would start my third exploration. After crossing an outcropping of boulders, I was struck with an almost infinite horizon on a silent ridge topped with a thick layer of snow. I began to study the horizon and how a cabin with a hearth might create a refuge in the saddle of this ridge. However, as a way to bring this cabin closer to its place, I proposed a thatch roof that would behave similarly to the shrubby grass buried under the snow. The consequence of embracing this material connection was that the roof had to become much steeper. As I reapproached the building, it was no longer a part of the horizon, but a point at which to enter it. The objects inside the cabin then began to choreograph how a hiker re-engaged the horizon. The chimney was treated as an extension of the stone foundation and was meant to greet a hiker as they entered the cabin, providing a place to disemburden and then be directed further into the space. The table in front of it came from extensive study of a maple slab I had been working with since last semester. I came to know it as an object that would best be admired by its circumnavigating it, while the gravity of its presence changed at different heights. I brought it into the cabin as the thickness of the slab felt it hung home among the stone of the chimney and the thickness of the thatch roof. Its beveled uprights and woven panels then began to influence or echo some of the tectonic decisions within the cabin. Its rippled edge and polished surface would change constantly under firelight, while during the day, the bedroom window would cast it in a monolithic shadow while activating the woven apertures of its base. As I discovered more about these objects, I began to learn more about what the space would become. The hearth, slab, roof, and horizon became an interconnected series of events that would bring someone in from the trail to drop their pack, get warm, and ponder the nature of this strange entity cast in firelight as it draws them around to a warm place to watch the clouds pass in the distance. Coming to the end of the thesis, what I enjoyed most about it was that every place began with something found, much like the objects that I began the year with. By considering the projects in the park also as things that I would build and inhabit, I was able to more curiously explore the places I was visiting and dive deeper into finding the characters that I was trying to evoke. It's my hope that in the future, these lessons will stay with me and that the work I produce will continue to better resonate with its place. Thank you all for your time. If there are any images you'd like to discuss further, please let me know.
Thank you very much, Graham. Comments and questions?
Graham, can you go backwards through your presentation and just do like half a second a slide, just to take us back to the beginning of your journey?
Let's see if I can move this train back.
Or pull a full Miro board or something. Even faster if you could just skim backward through it. I just want to get to the foundation of your narrative and you know, first, I just want to commend you on the kind of seduction that you've allowed yourself in the world of making as a kind of point of departure for reflecting and projecting into another form, in this case, a larger, you know, kind of territorial narrative and the selection of objects that you might place there that might have meaning. And the constant search between these things that are intuitively created and yet tactily felt, I think really is truly been for you in conjunction with your paintings, a kind of generative form of thinking and making. And it reminds me a little bit of Alto, who would do a tremendous amount of research on a particular project and think about it, think about it, think about it, then just go in a studio, do a painting. Painting had nothing to do with the project, but had everything to do with it. Of course, there's many teleological studies that show the dead-on match between that which you painted and that which was created as a building. But the element there that I'm bringing forward for your attention is this issue of scale. There's a casualness at a certain moment where the catenary shape of the stool that you created, which supports the body that's sitting on it, becomes translated quickly and immediately into a catenary of a canvas that is draped over to create a shelter. And when I see that, I think that was in your second, this one right here, this jump. And then let's go to the canvas. We go to a canvas elevated element right there. That was a quick translation. And then I see the kind of provocation of the hillsides and its grassy slopes, suggesting in a sense a new topography, which is a roofline that you might create over a house. And yet the kind of the recognition that it might need to be steeper evokes all of a sudden Utzon Sydney Opera House as a silhouette that adopts and adapts that kind of premise. Again, a very quick move. And so I think what becomes interesting here is if indeed this idea of the kind of the mindfulness in making, which is where you began, and the kind of projection into architecture can have a very strong link. I'm wondering whether a slower path from one element to the next might allow you to draw forward more from the world that you created with your hands, whether through the joint or the lathe or the kind of sculpture, and delay the kind of the translation that would come very quickly into architectural form, and see how little architecture you might do. And in the process of seeing how little architecture you might do, in fact, the poetry of the works that you've created that are both sculptures and furniture can actually maybe become more essential in nature rather than assemblages. So those are just thoughts that was provoked. I think it's a really beautiful journey that you've set yourself on, but I feel that the kind of self-criticality that will allow you to advance this further would potentially do better by delaying the conclusions and doing less in those conclusions.
Thanks so much.
That's a really interesting comment. I really appreciate that idea of time and delay, because when I was looking at your work, first I should say kudos to you for such a thoughtful and really beautiful, beautiful drawings. I think thoughtful way of thinking about how the structures are very responsive to their environment. And I thoroughly enjoyed the making of the object and the relation of the object to the kind of bigger spatial construct and that kind of connection that you have to the site. That to me was really fascinating. But your project reminded me a little bit of Walter Pickler. And he talks about time and this relationship between the sculpture and maybe the piece that he's creating, and then the house that might inhabit, and you might just want to look at his work as it relates to time. Your watercolors also were the thing that immediately struck me in terms of the relationship there. But the questions that I have revolve around kind of your bigger purpose in kind of the craft of what you're making in terms of these objects, and how that drives you as an architect. Is it about purely craft, or is it a bigger, because I think Thesis gives you the opportunity to explore some of these questions. Is it about the objects that you make by hand and then you understand as reflections of a very specific moment within the landscape, within time? Or is it a statement about contemporary life? I mean, I'm just wondering how you translate this into your future as an architect, and how it changes the kind of architect you plan to be in the future. And I know I'm asking a very vague question. It relates to that idea of time. and
Right.
these different scales of the things that we make and how they inform one another. And even the materials that you're using are, and the way you've assembled them are, like, they're traditional. They're what I would expect. And that's where part of me wants to push that envelope a little bit, that maybe the house that comes from the object, maybe the translation of that needs a different interpretation. And I'll keep thinking, I'll construct a better question by the end, but I just wanted to build on Marion's comment about time, because I think it's really important in your work.
Right, thank you.
I don't mind going in. I think it's a super interesting project, you know, fascinating comments so far, and possibly more eloquent than mine will be. I suppose from my perspective, you know, certainly having tackled topics of, sorry, I've got the obligatory Brooklyn siren for a moment. One of the, you know, challenges around the endless debate, which is whether architecture is indeed, you know, an industrial project or a craft-driven one, and artistic in many ways, and you working between mediums, and also retreating in, and that's not critique necessarily, into these romantic renderings of what it is you are seeking to propose spatially, because of course that, you know, you're exceptionally talented at drawing, evidently, but we don't necessarily, you know, foreground that as a means to determine space in the way that we once would. So that restraint regarding using more contemporary methods is interesting, because of course there are other alternatives, such as some form of hybrid drawing, which would afford different kind of perspectives onto the project. So, you know, you've got, you've in many ways controlling our interaction with the project, just in terms of the very medium you choose to use, and its inability to then move around it necessarily, and the traditions of an isometric, which is lovely to see, of course, and these days more extinct than I would like them to be. But there is comfort in these traditions, of course, because in a way that's what traditions are, a form of comfort. I think, though, we have to understand that the choice of rendering, in a way, visualization, has a kind of, like I mentioned before, romantic or even a political framing on what it is we're looking at. And, you know, any form of neo-vernacular, if this is what this is, you know, kind of is a confrontation, not just in terms of all the contemporary integrity regarding, you know, economy of materials and modesty of ambition structurally and materially and so on, but it's also to do with, you know, I think certain sensitivities about, you know, whether how far neo-vernacular is a departure from some kind of like historically subjective forms, and what feel to me like certain iterations regarding those forms, right? So I think it is acknowledging in some ways that you're working between, I don't know, I mean, I'm reminded in a way of Stephen Hall's attempt to define what critical regionalism is. I'm thinking also of Prince Charles's attempt to create an architecture school in London very briefly that was all about getting people to start sawing bits of wood all over again as part of their training. You know, I'm also thinking of Anne Klein's book, A Hut of One's Own, where she talks about just, you know, the modesty of structures around very limited forms of functionality, and the pleasure of that, not overburdening structures and interventions with too much program necessarily. And I felt, you know, very interested in the ways in which these forest secretions, if you like, were intended to kind of intentionally impose some form of, if you like, engagement with the natural environment that one might not do if one is just stomping through a forest wondering when the hell the misery is going to end and you want immediately to find a pub, etc., because it's chilly and rainy, or mainly my experience of British forests. So I think that, you know, I think there's a lot to be said, and it's mainly complementary. But if I were you, I would maybe, in not a self-effacing way, really start to think quite keenly about, if you like, the derivatives here, like what are these joints, what are these forms, what are they reminiscent of? You know, in some cases they have, there are sensitivities, you know, watchtowers, if you like, while intended to engage with the natural environment, for others are far more, you know, problematically symbolic. And, you know, so I think there is all sorts of, you know, subliminal narratives that can unfold from these sort of, you know, vernacular structures, that some are more problematic than others. And I'm just really intrigued as to how you might tell a particular story, or and add in a kind of story, or a kind of a consideration of what this might mean. If you are taking a position in relation to neo-vernacular, what then is it materially? I'm just kind of intrigued in that, and that's really a question rather than a piece of feedback, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments. No, there's a lot of, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to think about kind of in that, this idea of, you know, what exactly the assembly becomes, I guess, coming from that piece of furniture. I think kind of, that was one of the things kind of working through the thesis that, you know, was so daunting was, you know, maybe that's kind of one of the problems of it, was trying to make all these different things, right? Kind of, you know, on the one hand, it was sort of recognizing or trying to play within these different situations I was finding. But, you know, I think that's kind of what I enjoy about it, is that, you know, within this park as a place that I go to and, you know, think about a lot, you know, this is a project that really I see myself kind of coming back to or considering a lot. So
sure what to make of this project. It's very beautiful. You know how to draw. You know how to seduce us. What's strange is that you start with the objects, you start with an idea of craft, you start with a very particular, very beautiful site, and then the objects you wind up making are, forgive me, somewhat cliched, and they are, whether consciously or unconsciously, evocative of a tradition of kind of neo-modernist wood construction that tries to take the language of expressive structural form and orthogonal efficiency and marry it to local materials. Ironically, it was developed mainly in California in the Pacific Northwest. And so I don't know whether you consciously or unconsciously assimilate those, but it very much has that kind of quality. I might suggest to you that it would have been more interesting if you had not made the transformation from the stool to the object, not made the transformation from the cut into the overlook to the object sitting on the overlook, the kind of neo teepee or whatever that is, and not made the transition of the fishing cabin, but had rather thought about how you, given your skills, could unfold the actual landscape and create an affordance that would allow you to make use of that landscape to develop the kind of comfort. And Harriet, it's not as bad. It's actually quite pleasant for quite a bit of the year hiking through the landscapes here. And it's a very beautiful, it's a very beautiful landscape here, and it's a very wonderful experience. But finding ways that you could adjust and recraft that landscape rather than importing a bunch of logs and metal connections and a language of architecture to the site, I think might have been a very interesting way to take some of those original ideas forward.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions or comments, why don't we go to Lucie Rigaldies, Traversing Wonderland. That's the last presentation. And thank you, Graham, very much.
thank you all so much.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Marcia, and thank you everyone for being here. I'll start with a brief abstraction of the project, which is an exploration of the circulation of digital media as a condition that is rapidly changing the way we perceive space, and how we are now designing for two types of bodies, a real one and a virtual one. And as this condition engenders a new consciousness, both socially and as designers, this thesis emerges from a tension between the rigidity of fragmented digital space and the new realities that continuously move through it. So it's an inquiry that aims to capture architecture as an instrument for communication and as the media form through which we encounter a collective network. Starting with the emergence of technical media, humans have continued to store our most important information outside of our bodies and minds and into technical objects. It becomes increasingly central to the everyday lives of people who live in mass societies. And the more that we participate with these media platforms, the more the media begins to watch and respond to us. So looking at explorations regarding information processing, feedback loops, and questioning the boundaries between real and virtual, I've been inspired by Diller Scapidio's work and how they create scenes that collapse this opposition between what is authentic and what is mediated, as well as much of Toyo Ito's work, his writings, and his depictions of that necessity to plug into a media-saturated environment. And so I took inspiration from the fantasy novel Alice in Wonderland, as the narrative I'm working with tells a story of someone who mistakenly falls through a transient digital space and lands in today's version of a Wonderland, sort of this nonsense world of flux and often of confusion. And this video captures that story. It begins with a character falling through a screen the same way that Alice had fallen through the rabbit hole. And as they land in this elusive reel of images, screens display glimpses into other realities. And the character observes these, what we might call apertures, and it prompts them to search for a way out. And here they are trying to smash the screen in a very agitated effort to make it out of there. So what I'm trying to articulate is how these systems are about consciousness and replication, and does so by simulating the behavior of light. As Donna Haraway might put it, our best machines are made of sunshine. And in that sense, it really is a new nature for us. It is an extension of our environment. And so I've situated the thesis in the city of Chicago, largely characterized by its above ground transit infrastructure, which can be seen as a network that continuously flows through an otherwise very rigid urban grid. So to explore an intervention, I looked at buildings that are designed to give active access to information networks or explore alternative ways of connecting people throughout a building, spaces that try to rethink the library as more of a media center and something that provides for technological contingencies. For a program, the work suggests an open and interactive space for the presentation of emerging media that might be superimposed with a laboratory for its production. The work then manifests itself at this intersection of rectilinear space with curvilinear space, production with display, and the real with the virtual. So I'm now going to show an ecology of views and formats that unfold particular modes of experiencing the work. It is an endless panorama that is always expanding or receding. We begin in what might be a contemporary workspace, cluttered with various media and all the wires and electrical lines that connect and flow between corresponding parts. The wires continue to meander through the square space, and a modular framework emerges. We start to see some sight lines and the elevated train line that runs along South State Street in a street intersection that is just south of the loop. And as the lines weave through this modularity, they begin to form into the circulation space. They form into spiraling ramps, and lining these ramps are panels or screens or apertures into views of the city. It morphs from plan to axon to section and continues to melt into these different formats. So within this modular framework, spaces are permeated by flows of information and depict a blurry, open-ended, and moving architecture. And the moving images that are displayed are all from scenes in Chicago, mostly showing time lapses of transit networks and moving infrastructure. The work continues to evolve now into a more tangible series of spaces. These sets of interconnected components allow us to identify parts or wholes like an aperture or a screen or floor, at the same time that it reminds us that these identities are fluid, and that all we can really point to are a series of flows and relationships that intersect and hold together long enough to form an architectural identity. The substance of this intervention is then not necessarily a specific set of materials, but rather a system of knowledge, languages, and technologies. All of the floor plans follow a similar logic, yet no floor plan is the same. It's assembled by a modular framework, but the building is traversed by spiraling ramps that have to weave through its rigidity. And physical media is then placed along the perimeters of the ramps and the cores. These moving surfaces that you see might be literal screens displaying light, or they might be of another material on which to project light onto or to project light through. And besides the vertical cores, there are essentially no walls in the building. There are only the shifting media panels, which have the capacity to drastically alter the space. And like most urban sites, the building is forced into a rectilinear volume, but through its grid, there is this tension between the rigidity of fragmented digital space and the new realities that constantly flow through it. And here, some of the modular assemblies on the left, an elevator, a spiraling staircase, and then a portion of a spiraling ramp. A closer view of the screens and how those panels run along the circulation space. So ultimately, the building is entirely open, yet always fragmentary. It's endlessly perforated to allow for these mediated interactions. It's both a mirror and an audience at once, essentially an accumulation of both information and material. So that's the end, and thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lucie.
Why are the screens or the projection surfaces all vertical? And why, in your section, it seems like there are very little of the ramps that actually ramp up and down, or is that just, I guess I see more of them now. But let's just stick to that one question. Why are they, why vertical surfaces? Why not on the ceiling, on the floor? Why not enveloping you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I guess I saw the screens or the panels as sort of replacing walls, but not necessarily having to be a wall, just something that could move. Like instead of having walls, you just have these shifting panels that surround the cores and the circulation space.
That's a really interesting answer, and I would push you a little bit further, because I really love that section you had near the beginning of all of the people working at their desks with the wires. And the implication was, of course, that all of that connective tissue is disappearing. It's going the way of the L's and all the other infrastructure of meat space, and is making way for a kind of Alice in Wonderland set of relations, which is more an oniric or dreamlike set of relations that can exist, that can warp in and out of time and space, as our realities do much more quickly as we zoom in on our phones, etc. So I was hoping that what you were going to have in the end was a kind of rabbit hole version of this, in which the focal points or the work areas or the soft environment in which people surround themselves has dissolved and has become at the same time freer, and, as you indicated in your story of the person caught, more imprisoning, exactly because of it's so elusive, which is a very long critique. I'm sorry. I think it's a really beautiful project and really exactly what a thesis should be doing in terms of its kind of exploration of both ideas and architectural elements. But I wish you had sort of brought it home to having the evocation of this floating world not just be the panels that confront us in the manner of paintings or familiar artifacts, but had actually become more difficult to grasp in their relationship, or more unstable in their relationship to the very old-fashioned grid and even ramp system that you've established. That sort of felt like it was tending, and then I was quite frankly a little disappointed when I wound up with this array of panels as the kind of content that's shown forth. Great way of showing it, by the way, with the drawings with these images flickering through it, really evocative.
But that's interesting you say that, and it's kind of something that I battled with all year. And part of me wanted to make a real building in a tangible space, and part of me just wanted to go crazy in Wonderland. So there are aspects of both, but essentially I just see it as this reflection of the conditions that we're in this battle between, you know, analog and digital, or, you know, something normal and something not real.
You know, Lucie, I really loved your presentation, your provocation, your project, and in a sense, the restraint by which you gave us the sense of motion and nervousness that comes from screens that are constantly changing. And then in a sense, the kind of scaffold of the building remaining as a scaffold, because indeed it's really just, if you will, it's kind of a backdrop to the narrative that you're trying to take us through, which is a tension, I would say, between something real and something projected and captured. And I guess I want to pick up a little bit on what Erin has said, because this is truly a thesis. You are thinking very hard about a very topical question that is really very much where we are in the midst of. In the way we engage even right now for your thesis. You're not pinning up large drawings on a wall or models on the floor that we can pick up and touch and talk to. And yet you've sustained the kind of tactile engagement that we might all long for, but added something to it, which is a surprising sort of conflation between the hand sketch, if you will, the kind of scaffold drawing, and then this animated element. What I'm struck by, though, is that the self-sameness of the floor plates, the self-sameness of the ramps, the self-sameness of the screens in many ways doesn't yet leverage the differentiation by which the media that you're bringing to the structure could take for us. And so I begin to wonder about the things that might actually differentiate this experience. For instance, I don't know if you know Doug Aitken's incredible piece that he did at the Hirshhorn, where he projected this amazing film on the diameter, the external diameter of the Hirshhorn. And in the backdrop, you could hear and see only 1,000 different people singing, "I Only Have Eyes for You." And the kind of transcendence of that particular piece was so remarkable because it was a scale that was both urban and intimate and actually thrived in our minds now, so that you could actually put it on your iPhone and play it. And it makes me cry every time, and I can't quite figure out why I get so emotional about it, but it's an amazing piece. Now, when I look at what you created here, we are seeing it in section, and it is most alive in section. If we use that as a point of departure, one might wonder whether in fact we need to destroy 1, 2, 3, or 4 floors of the building to be able to create a super large immersive, entered only through a dark screen precinct that is a contrast to the narrative arches that maybe you can walk around and take your time upon. There may be something that is as large as a drive-in theater in the underground, because indeed these elements suspend down because in fact you get darkness in the underground where parking might have been, for instance. So just as you can kind of tune the kind of critique that you have of what that kind of, if you will, the artifact of the digital, which is primarily the screen, which can always change. Just as you tune that leap as it makes it into architecture, you can tune the scale, the impact, the number of people, the presentation or projection of versus the inheritance of. So I think you're really on to something extraordinary, and I really believe in the process that you're taking on, which involves a lot of restraint. And yet I think that we could actually benefit, and you could benefit by bringing a few more ingredients now into the surface of what you're doing, which might indeed allow you to push it, critique it, destroy it, and project it forward even further.
Well, thank you so much.
Hi, Lucie. I saw your project earlier, and it's really extraordinary. But I have a few more questions now, and well, first I should say something that I think I said earlier. I really appreciate your discovery of different methods of representation to talk about animation, in the kind of still drawing. I think the implications of the project about the gridded space, the freedom of thinking about visualization in different ways, what it means to store knowledge. I think all of those things are really important questions to be asking. But as I see the conclusion of it, and you said yourself that you wanted to contain this in a building, it makes me wonder quite a bit about some of the questions that you ask about the city of Chicago, the relationship of the building to the city, why this project is contained, why are we looking at screens? Will screens become archaic, or what kind of future will we have that takes us away from the screens? I'm thinking about even virtual reality or different ways of thinking about artificial intelligence. Also thinking about questions of the library in terms of the storage of data and information, but also the kind of active archiving that we're currently in, where it's almost simultaneous communication that's happening around the city, and the kind of rate of responsiveness. These are all questions that I have when thinking about your project, and you kept talking about transportation systems in a way, or transitory, and so I started to imagine in your drawings that this library wasn't limited to the building that you contained it in, with a series of screens on each floor. Maybe there is kind of moments or places within the city that there's a plug, and that plug happens to be a building, but that this thing that you're trying to create or to talk about is an activated tissue that is throughout the city. And it's not only about the kind of archival information that you can retrieve, but also the communication of voices that are active in the context of that city. And if you think about artificial intelligence, also about the production of new knowledge and speculation about new futures. And I think that there's a lot to unpack in kind of the different layers of your project. I certainly think that it does everything a thesis is meant to do, which is maybe construct more questions than it answers. So it's a compliment to you. But for me, the project can be so much more than the screens on each floor, with what I'm imagining you're proposing is like a glass or kind of an open container in a more relatively traditional site. But maybe that wasn't your intention, but that was how I read that kind of last image. And I'm much more excited about these images that you have, where there's almost like an open-ended network or a grid, and there are screens of different scales and sizes. Yes, exactly. The one before this one that you just showed, that kind of stretched in a more kind of linear pattern. Or even some of these where the structure of the building is ambiguous to me, whether it's screens, whether it's infrastructure of different forms of technology. Anyway, I really appreciate the projects and all the questions that you asked, but I don't think it's done. I think that there are different layers that you could begin to explore.
Well, thank you so much. There's a lot that I can respond and unpack from what you just said. I do agree. I feel like with the thesis, it's never done. For any project, there's always more. Yeah, in terms of the screens, I saw them as more open to interpretation as to what exactly they are. Maybe they are screens, or maybe they are another material that you project light onto. Maybe they are slightly transparent and light is going through them. But ultimately, it's just meant to be a set of interconnected components that store, transport, or even transform materials and energy and information. And in terms of the building expanding outside of itself, because it's a modular system, the parts can exist on their own and they can be placed or plugged in anywhere essentially. But in any system, how the parts work together is just as important as their individual characteristics, and how they're agglomerated on the site that I chose makes them form a unique network physically and virtually in the way that they are placed, in the way that they interact, the same way that a digital image is constructed by individual bits and pixels to form one identity. And yeah, I guess I would describe new media or emerging media as a cultural process that's right now enabled by network communication technologies. And it's really hard to speculate what our media will look like in 2-3 decades. But yeah, I mean, I would hope that the building could provide for those contingencies.
I guess the criticism is not so much whether it's a screen or not a screen, it's its place versus the viewer, and its place in the building and the building's place. So I think we're all looking for a stronger destabilization of what is still a relationship governed by a long tradition. It's a museum essentially, with different materials and modes. And I think we're looking just for something a little bit questioning of that mode.
Yeah, and just to riff off of Aaron's comments, I just want to hats off to Ashley, Killian, Heather, and others who are in the chat offering you all kinds of feedback. Just one thing I'd like to suggest is, I agree with Aaron's suggestion that this is a vernacular. You talk about it being a future, kind of technological space, but I see it's very retrospective in many ways, because technologies at the rate at which they're moving and then where they're atomized and localized to our iPhones and our Androids means that what's the incentive almost to going to an environment to see multiple versions of what I can see on my phone anyway. And I think that, what I found more profound about the project were all the things that you haven't defined it as. For me, it looks like the optimum pandemic environment where I can go and feel connected to lots of screens of lots of different things while being in some ways distanced potentially from other users. Using the grid in that way offers some way of choreographing movement through the space that could actually keep people fairly segregated, and yet being surrounded by all these images, I might be incentivized to go here rather than revert to my phone to feel some sense of community and connectivity in ways that defeat the atomization that COVID has imposed upon all of us. I think one should be very cautious of, in making claims about future technologies, and techno-utopianism in general is problematic. But just looking at all the comments, you've got lots of different ideas here and lots of different readings of what this potentially could be. And it reminded me a bit of Louis Kahn's quote that a great question is always better than a brilliant answer, and that your project provokes so many questions maybe is indicative of some degree of brilliance here. But be mindful of what technology is and the limitations of what it could do, and this idea that it isn't anything other than a moving target, which is why I think Aaron's insight about it being much more of a museum to technologies more than anything, rather than some sort of future rendering of technologies, is more compelling. And just look, for example, at what a lot of the museums are doing. San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, if you text them some form of emoticon or emoji, it will send you back an image from its collection that looks a bit like the emoji you've sent them. And you may have heard of selfie museums, but they're a huge thing now everywhere. So there's ways in which one could, if you're going to use screens like this, I think toggle off of a lot of youth culture and maybe be specific about the end user in that way, because that might actually contain some of the more ambitious claims about what this building can do or thinks it's doing, if it's more localized around this sense of community in a space of otherwise clinical absence and segregation, if it's more about this notion of co-authorship of technological platforms and co-production of imagery relative to, in this slightly gallery-like museum space, how does it connect necessarily to all of the existing innovations that youth culture are presenting, to architects is the latest challenge on an argument for any kind of architecture at all. So I think that, you know, you could advance this ideologically to a different level, and respectfully, you've got some fantastic feedback from all of these great minds in the chat. I think hopefully are questions that you might want to consider. But yeah, just some thoughts from me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's actually SF MoMA, when I was curator there, we were the first ones to collect websites as websites. And they have a long tradition of showing time-based media and digital native material. It's a field that really could use a lot of research and looking at, and it's very difficult for architecture to encompass. Pam and Dick Kramlich, the local billionaires and supporters of SF MoMA, have built up the largest collection of time-based media, which they put into something called the New Art Trust. And they had Herzog de Meuron design a $40 million home for them in Napa Valley to house it. And Herzog de Meuron worked very hard to try to break down the architecture, but it's still basically a tomb. And so now they've actually hired Yves Behar, who I don't know if you caught his lecture a couple of days ago. He gave a wonderful lecture to us here to find alternate ways to present their work. And so understanding that kind of pushing at the limits, I think given your talent, you could probably do better than Herzog de Meuron. So that's the challenge I would give you, is to go beyond Herzog de Meuron and really make digital native art into something that escapes from the museum.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Lucie, and everyone else who has presented today. We are going to end right now. Well, I mean, not for the jurors, but for everyone else. So if you could leave, and the jurors will stay behind, and we will talk about the honor awards now. Thank you, everyone. And at about 1 o'clock, we will announce the awards.
Thanks and congratulations to all of you.